They said genius doesn't live in grease-stained hands. Mason Cross lost everything: his wife, his career, his future, yet spent years quietly building something in a dark California garage that could save millions of lives. Then, the most powerful woman in the automotive industry walked through that door, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "This is a waste of paper." She was wrong, catastrophically wrong. And somewhere between her arrogance and his grief, a collision was coming that neither of them could survive unchanged. This is that story. Stay until the end. Hit like, drop your city in the comments, and let me see how far this story travels. The smell hit you first. That was always how it was with Mason Cross's garage. Before you saw anything, before your eyes adjusted to the dim California afternoon light filtering through the two small windows on the western wall, before you registered the shapes of vehicles in various stages of disassembly, you got the smell. Motor oil and metal shavings and something underneath both of those things. Something older and harder to name. Like the garage itself had absorbed years of quiet, solitary work and was giving it back to you all at once. Mason didn't notice the smell anymore. He hadn't noticed it in years. He was lying on his back on a rolling creeper beneath a 1987 Porsche 911 Carrera, and he was thinking about a fuel line that didn't want to cooperate, and he was also, in the back of his mind, thinking about dinner. He'd promised Lily something other than pasta tonight. She hadn't complained. She never complained about pasta, or about much of anything really, which sometimes worried him more than complaints would have, but he'd seen the way she looked at the box of rotini on Tuesday, and he'd made a mental note. "Dad? Dad, your phone's been buzzing for like 10 minutes. He slid out from under the car. Lily was standing at the workbench, arms crossed, 12 years old, and already carrying herself with a kind of self-possessed calm that made him proud and sad simultaneously. She had her mother's dark eyes. She had her mother's habit of standing with her weight slightly on one leg when she was waiting for someone to catch up to her thinking. "Which phone?" He asked. "The real one. Not the parts one." He sat up on the creeper and wiped his hands on the rag he kept tucked in his back pocket. The phone was on the workbench beside a coffee mug that had gone cold 2 hours ago. 3 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize, San Francisco area code. "Probably a warranty thing," he said. "You don't sell warranties." "Which is why I'm not worried about it." Lily picked up the coffee mug, made a face at its temperature, and set it back down. She was supposed to be doing homework at the small desk he'd set up in the corner of the garage, near enough that he could see her, far enough that the fumes weren't an issue, but the desk was empty and the homework was presumably wherever homework went when a 12-year-old decided something more interesting was happening. "Mrs. Delgado called the house phone," Lily said. "She said her Civic's been making a noise." "I know. I called her back yesterday. She's dropping it off Thursday." "She said it sounds like a dying cat." "It's the alternator belt. Alternator belts don't sound like dying cats. They sound like—" "It doesn't matter." He stood up, joints popping in ways that reminded him he was 32 and had been spending too many hours on concrete floors. "Go finish your homework." "I finished it." "All of it?" "Math, English, and the history worksheet that Mr. Patterson somehow thinks is an appropriate amount of work for a Wednesday." She said this with the flat delivery of someone reporting facts rather than complaining, which was somehow more devastating as a critique. "Can I stay out here?" "Keep the fan running and don't touch the Porsche." "I never touched the Porsche." "You touched it last week." "I looked at it very closely. There's a difference." He almost smiled. Didn't quite get there, but almost. The garage was on the eastern edge of a small town called Harlow, which sat between Fresno and nowhere in particular, which suited Mason fine. He'd grown up in Sacramento, studied engineering at UC Davis on a scholarship that he'd had to fight 3 different financial aid offices to keep, worked for 4 years at a major automotive firm in Detroit before everything changed, and ended up here the way a river ends up at whatever low point the landscape offers, not by planning, but by the logic of gravity and obstacle. The garage had belonged to a man named Gerald Hoyt, who'd run it as an actual repair shop for 30 years before his knees gave out and his son moved him to Phoenix. Mason had bought the lease for almost nothing. He'd fixed the structural issues himself over the course of a winter. He'd installed better lighting, better ventilation, the proper storage systems for the tools he'd acquired piece by piece over 2 years of careful, patient shopping. He hadn't done it all at once. He'd done it the way he did most things, slowly, deliberately, with a clear idea of what he was building toward. The shop itself was legitimate. He had 8 regular clients, mostly people with older vehicles that dealerships wouldn't touch or couldn't be bothered to. And he had a reputation in town for being honest about what something cost and accurate about when it would be ready. He didn't overcharge. He didn't invent problems. He didn't try to sell people things they didn't need. In a service industry, this was apparently remarkable enough that word spread, but the repair work wasn't what occupied his mind. In the back of the garage, past the main bay where the vehicles sat, past the tool storage and the small bathroom with its unreliable hot water, there was a room. It had been Gerald Hoyt's office once. Mason had cleared out the filing cabinets and the ancient desk and replaced them with a drafting table, 2 task lights, a second-hand bookshelf that ran floor to ceiling, and more paper than was probably reasonable for any individual to own. The paper was covered in drawings, not sketches, drawings. Precise, detailed, dimensionally accurate technical drawings done in mechanical pencil and occasionally in ink, with notations in Mason's small, clear handwriting along the margins. Anyone who knew what they were looking at would have recognized them immediately as engineering blueprints. Anyone who knew the field they represented would have looked twice, then a third time, and then probably sat down. Mason had been working on the same problem for 6 years. Vehicle safety systems had advanced dramatically in the 21st century. Lane departure warnings, automatic emergency braking, adaptive cruise control, collision avoidance technology that could detect a pedestrian in low light and respond faster than human reflexes. But the systems didn't talk to each other well. They were designed and tested in isolation, integrated after the fact, and when they interacted imperfectly. There were gaps that existed in the space between one system's response and another's, gaps measured in fractions of a second that nonetheless translated in certain accident scenarios into the difference between survival and catastrophe. Mason knew about those gaps. He knew about them the way you know about a splinter you've been carrying for so long you've stopped feeling it as pain and started feeling it as part of yourself. He'd been working on a unified integration framework, a way of redesigning the architecture of how vehicle safety systems communicated with each other, not just adding new features, but rebuilding the conversation between existing ones. He used predictive modeling algorithms that anticipated driver response patterns rather than simply reacting to them. He developed a sensor fusion approach that was genuinely new, not an iteration on what existed, but a different way of thinking about what the sensors were supposed to be doing. It was, by any reasonable engineering assessment, extraordinary work. The problem was that the only person who'd ever seen it was his daughter, who was 12, and who had responded by saying, "This one looks like a robot octopus," about one of the sensor array diagrams, which was technically not wrong. He'd kept it private deliberately. He wasn't ready. Or, more honestly, he was afraid. The work connected to the worst thing that had ever happened to him, and showing it to anyone meant exposing the worst thing, and he hadn't figured out how to do that yet. So the drawings stayed in the back room, and Mason fixed other people's cars and made pasta more often than he intended, and got better at helping Lily with her homework, even though her math had already exceeded his practical memory of the subject. That was his life. It was quiet. It was contained. It was, on most days, enough. On the afternoon that everything changed, he was lying under the Porsche again when he heard the car. It was the engine note that reached him first. Something expensive and well-maintained. The specific smooth idle of a vehicle that gets serviced on schedule by people who know what they're doing. He heard it pull into the gravel lot outside, heard it cut off, heard the door close with the solid, weighted thunk of German engineering. He didn't move. Clients came without calling sometimes. It was fine. He heard Lily's voice. "Can I help you?" In the careful, slightly formal register she used with strangers, which she'd developed entirely on her own, and which he found both impressive and faintly heartbreaking, because no 12-year-old should need a formal register for strangers. Then a different voice, female, clear, carrying the particular quality of someone accustomed to being heard in rooms where people were not necessarily inclined to listen. "I'm looking for the owner." "He's under the car." A pause. Under it. Under the Porsche, he does that. I see. Another pause, different quality. Could you let him know Victoria Sterling is here to speak with him about a business matter? Mason's hands stopped moving. He knew the name. Everyone in automotive engineering knew the name. Victoria Sterling had inherited her father's position at Sterling Automotive Group at 26, had spent 4 years being dismissed as a figurehead, and had then proceeded to reshape the company with a precision and aggression that had silenced every dismissal and generated several industry awards and at least 2 magazine covers. She was 30 years old. She ran a company that employed 14,000 people and generated annual revenue in the billions. She was standing in his gravel parking lot in Harlow, California. He slid out from under the Porsche. Victoria Sterling was taller than he'd expected from photographs. She was dressed in a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, dark trousers, shoes that cost more than most of what he owned. She was looking around the garage with an expression that she probably thought was neutral, but was actually, if you knew how to read faces, something slightly short of contempt. The particular look of someone who has seen exactly what they expected to see and is being proven right about it. Behind her, near the entrance, a man in a suit who was clearly an assistant was holding a leather portfolio and looking at his phone. "Mr. Cross," she said. "Miss Sterling." He wiped his hands on the rag. He was aware, suddenly and acutely, of his appearance. The worn work pants, the old Henley with the small burn mark near the collar, the 3 days of stubble he hadn't gotten around to addressing. He was also aware that being aware of it was itself annoying, and he set the awareness aside. "Wasn't expecting company? I apologize for the lack of notice. I was in the area. We're evaluating a manufacturing facility in Fresno, and I wanted to see the place in person." She said it like this was perfectly normal, like showing up unannounced at a man's garage was a reasonable business practice. "See the place?" Mason repeated. "There are rumors," she said, "in Harlow, about a mechanic who used to be an engineer. My regional director mentioned it." He looked at her steadily. "Rumors. That you do exceptional work, that you have ideas." She glanced around the garage again, and that expression flickered across her face again. "I like to evaluate claims personally." "That's thorough of you." She didn't pick up on the dryness, or she picked it up and chose not to acknowledge it, which was probably more accurate. "I understand you've been developing some concepts," she said. "Independently. Safety systems?" The room got very quiet. Mason could feel Lily looking at him from the corner. "Where did you hear that?" he said, and his voice came out even, which he was grateful for. "It's a small industry," Victoria said. "Word travels." "What word specifically?" She tilted her head slightly. "That you have blueprints, designs of some kind. Our regional director said the local engineering program at the community college. You gave a talk there a year ago?" He had. He'd agreed to it as a favor to the department head, who was a decent man who'd been trying to give his students exposure to working engineers. Mason had talked for 45 minutes about materials science and automotive design principles, general enough to be useful, specific enough to be interesting. He hadn't mentioned his own work. But the department head had mentioned afterward, over coffee, that Mason had been doing some private design work, and apparently that had traveled further than Mason had realized. "I gave a talk," Mason said, "about engineering fundamentals. May I see the designs?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the assistant with the portfolio, who was still looking at his phone with the studied neutrality of someone paid to be invisible. Then he looked at Lily, who was watching all of this with complete attention, her homework forgotten. "Come on back," he said. He led her through the garage, past the tool walls and the work bay, through the narrow door into the back room. He turned on both task lights. The room filled with the warm, slightly yellow light that he'd always meant to improve and never had. The drawings covered the drafting table completely, and the overflow was pinned to a corkboard that ran most of the eastern wall, and the further overflow was stacked in labeled folders on the bookshelf. Victoria Sterling stopped in the doorway. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the room. Then she stepped inside and walked toward the drafting table, and Mason watched her look at the drawings on top. The sensor fusion architecture, which was where he'd been working most recently. She leaned over it. Her assistant appeared in the doorway behind them, and Victoria waved a hand without turning around, and the assistant retreated. She studied the drawing for perhaps 40 seconds. Then she straightened up. "These are hand-drawn," she said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I work better that way. The iteration is faster for me on paper than in CAD at the early stage." She looked at another drawing, then another. She flipped through the stack on the left side of the drafting table, not carelessly, but not with the attention that the drawings deserved, the attention of someone assessing quickly rather than understanding deeply. "These are ambitious," she said. Her tone had shifted slightly. It wasn't warmer exactly, but it had gained a certain careful quality, like someone choosing words. "They're functional," Mason said. "They're not theoretical." "Have you modeled them?" "Not with full simulation software. I've run the mathematical modeling by hand and verified it against established safety data. The frameworks hold." She turned to look at him directly for the first time since entering the back room. There was something in her expression that might have been reassessment, or might have been the beginning of a pitch. "Sterling Automotive has one of the best safety research departments in the industry," she said. 40 engineers, full simulation capabilities, a testing facility in New Mexico. She paused. "We've been working on exactly this class of problem for 3 years." "I know," Mason said. "I've read your published research." "And?" "And you're approaching it from the wrong direction. You're optimizing individual systems and then trying to integrate them afterward. That's not an integration problem, it's an architecture problem. You have to design the communication framework first and build the systems around it." Something moved in her face. He couldn't tell exactly what. "That's a significant claim," she said. "It's an accurate one." She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up one of the drawings, the central integration framework diagram, which was the most complex and also the most fundamental, and she looked at it for a long moment. Mason watched her eyes move across it. He could tell when someone was reading an engineering drawing versus looking at one, and she was looking at it. She had the business acumen to understand that something was here, but she didn't have the technical depth to read what it actually said. "What would it take," she said, "to bring this work into a professional environment, with proper resources, proper support?" Mason looked at her. She was still holding the drawing, and something about that, about watching someone hold 6 years of his life between two fingers like a brochure they hadn't decided whether to keep, made something tighten in his chest. "Miss Sterling," he said, "with respect, what would you do with it?" She blinked. She was not, he thought, someone who got asked clarifying questions very often. "Develop it. Commercialize it. If the technology is what you're suggesting, it is. Then it represents significant market value. Sterling Automotive would be interested in market value," he said quietly. "That's what innovation becomes, Mr. Cross, if it gets built." He looked at her for a long moment. The task lights hummed. Outside, faintly, he could hear a truck passing on the county road. "Those drawings represent 6 years of work," he said. "They also represent something personal, something that matters to me for reasons that have nothing to do with market value." He held out his hand, and after a moment she gave him the drawing back. "I'm not ready to hand them off to a corporation, even a well-resourced one." "I'm not asking you to hand them off. I'm asking about it." "I heard what you asked. My answer is that I need to think about it." She studied him. Whatever she was looking for, she apparently didn't find because she pressed on. "Mr. Cross, I'll be direct. These drawings," she gestured at the room, "what I can evaluate technically suggests something interesting, but interesting isn't enough. The industry moves fast. Ideas don't survive in garages, they survive in labs with proper engineering teams, with simulation infrastructure and testing protocols." She paused. "You're clearly talented. The fact that you've done this here with no resources is impressive. But without professional support, these designs will remain exactly what they are right now." "And what is that?" She paused for just a beat too long. "A promising sketch," she said. He heard it land. He felt it land, which was worse. He also heard Lily shift in the doorway. He hadn't known she'd followed them back. And when he glanced over, her expression was carefully still in the way it got when she was controlling a strong reaction. "I appreciate you coming," Mason said. His voice was level. He kept it level deliberately. "And I appreciate the assessment. Mr. Cross, I'd like to think it over. That's all. I'm not making a decision in the next 20 minutes. He moved toward the door, and after a moment, Victoria Sterling, who was clearly unaccustomed to this particular kind of exit, stepped aside. "I'll walk you out." She followed him through the garage. At the entrance, she stopped. "Think it over," she said. "But don't wait too long." She produced a business card and set it on the edge of his workbench. Heavy paper, clean design. "Time matters in this industry." "I know," he said. "I used to be in it." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she nodded once, the curt, precise nod of someone used to moving to the next item on a list, and walked out to her car. The assistant followed. The expensive German door closed with its expensive German thunk. The engine turned over smooth as anything, and they were gone. Mason stood in the entrance of his garage and listened to the gravel settle. Behind him, Lily said, "She was horrible." "She was direct," Mason said. "There's a difference." "She called your work a sketch." "She doesn't know what she's looking at." "She should have looked harder." He turned around. Lily was standing by the workbench, arms crossed exactly the way she'd been standing when he slid out from under the Porsche an hour ago. Her jaw was set in a way that he recognized as the outer sign of something interior and significant. "Hey," he said. "It's fine." "It's not fine. Dad, what she said—" "Lily, what she said wasn't true. Your designs are not a sketch. You've been working on them for as long as I can remember. I did research on the systems you're improving. I found papers about this class of problem, and your framework is not just interesting, it's—" She stopped, breathed. She didn't even try to understand them. Mason looked at his daughter and felt the complicated thing he always felt when she did this, when she defended him, or worried about him, or loved him, with that fierce and practical intensity she'd had since she was small. It made him proud. It also made him aware, with an ache that never entirely went away, that she'd had to become that person, that certain parts of her childhood had calcified into this particular kind of protectiveness. "She's a CEO," he said. "She evaluates things quickly. It's not personal." It felt personal. It wasn't meant to be. Lily looked at him steadily. "Are you going to call her?" He picked up the business card, looked at it, set it back on the workbench. "I don't know," he said honestly. He went back to the Porsche. The fuel line still didn't want to cooperate. He lay on the creeper and slid back underneath and picked up where he'd left off, and after a few minutes he heard Lily go back to her desk and heard the small sounds of a textbook opening. The garage was quiet again, the same quiet it always was, but it felt different now, like a room where someone has opened a window. The same room, the same walls, but the air has changed and you can't quite close the window all the way back. He worked on the fuel line for another hour, fixed it. The Porsche started on the first try when he tested it, which gave him the brief, clean satisfaction that solving mechanical problems always gave him, a satisfaction that was uncomplicated and immediate in a way that most of his life was not. He washed up, heated leftover soup for dinner, made Lily's, made his own, sat at the small kitchen table in the house attached to the garage, a modest two-bedroom that came with the property, and ate across from his daughter. She didn't mention Victoria Sterling again. Neither did he. But that night, after Lily was asleep, Mason went back to the garage. He didn't turn on the main lights, just the two task lights in the back room. He stood at the drafting table and looked at the drawings. The years of them, the weight of them, the love and grief and obsessive careful work embedded in every line. A promising sketch. He thought about a woman named Sarah who had brown eyes exactly the color Lily's were, and who had laughed at his engineering diagrams not because she thought they were worthless, but because she thought they were extraordinary in the specific way that only the people who love you can see extraordinary, clearly without trying. He thought about a highway at night and rain and the particular nothing of a safety system that didn't respond in time. He pulled out the central integration framework diagram and set it under the light. He looked at it for a long time. Then he sat down and started revising it. He worked until 2 in the morning. The work was good. It had always been good, and he had always known it, and the fact that he'd needed someone else to dismiss it to remind him of that was not a fact he was particularly comfortable with. But it was true, and he didn't believe in lying to himself. He went to bed at 2:15, listened to the house settle in the dark, and thought about tomorrow. The business card was still on the workbench. He hadn't decided anything, but he also hadn't thrown it away. 3 days passed. On the first day, he finished the Porsche and called the owner, who came to pick it up in the afternoon. On the second day, he started on Mrs. Delgado's Civic and confirmed what he'd suspected about the alternator belt, and also found a brake pad situation that he called her about immediately, and she agreed to have fixed, which was the right call. On the third day, Lily had early release from school and spent the afternoon at the garage doing homework and occasionally asking him questions about automotive engineering with the focused, methodical curiosity that reminded him, sometimes painfully, of himself at the same age. "Why do you draw everything by hand?" she asked, late in the afternoon. She was sitting at her desk but had pivoted toward him, homework apparently concluded. "I told you, I think better that way." "But you could use software." "I could. It would be faster." "For some parts. Not for the early thinking. When I'm working something out for the first time, the software is too clean. I make decisions I shouldn't make yet because the tool forces them. Paper keeps options open." She considered this. "That makes sense?" "It's also cheaper." "That's the less interesting reason." "Both are true." She looked toward the back room. "Can I look at the new drawings? You were working on something after I went to bed." He paused. "How do you know I was working after you went to bed?" "Because the light was on in the garage at midnight when I got up for water." He thought she was asleep. He said, "The integration framework, the central one. I was revising the response latency model." "Because of what she said?" He looked at his daughter. She was looking at him with those brown eyes that didn't miss anything. "Because I saw something I wanted to improve," he said. "The visit didn't change the work. It just reminded me to look at it again." Lily was quiet for a moment. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "You just asked me 4 things." "A different something." He set down the wrench. "Yeah. Do you ever think about going back? To the industry? Like, for real?" The question sat in the air between them. "I think about it," he said carefully. "But you don't." "No." "Why?" He picked the wrench back up, turned it over in his hands. The metal was warm from his grip. "It's complicated," he said. "I know it's complicated. I'm 12, not 6. He almost smiled again, closer than usual. "The industry is full of people who think exactly the way Miss Sterling thinks," he said. "They move fast and they measure things in market value, and they evaluate quickly, and they're not wrong to do all of that. It's how large systems function. But the work I care about doesn't move at that pace. The work I care about is slower, more careful." "You could make it move slower," Lily said, "if you had enough leverage." "Where did you learn the word leverage in that context?" "Podcast." "What podcast?" "Engineering Leadership one. I've been listening to them." He looked at her. She looked back, entirely unabashed. "You've been listening to Engineering Leadership podcasts," he said. "You listen to them too. I can hear them through the wall." He didn't have an answer for that. He went back to the Civic. Lily went back to her desk. The afternoon light shifted across the garage floor, and outside the window the sky turned the particular color it turned in the Fresno Valley in autumn. Not quite orange, not quite gold, something between the two that didn't have a name. The business card was still on the workbench. That night, while Lily slept and the house was quiet, Mason went to the back room and looked at the drawings for a long time. Then he went to the workbench and picked up the business card. He held it for a while. He set it back down. He went to bed. On the 4th day, he woke up before dawn with the particular clarity that comes sometimes after sleep. Not a decision exactly, more like an understanding that the decision had been made somewhere below the level of conscious deliberation, and he was just now being informed. He wasn't going to call Victoria Sterling, not because the work wasn't ready, not because she'd been dismissive, but because the work needed to be seen on its own terms, completely, by people capable of reading it, and handing it to a corporation who would evaluate it through the lens of market value and competitive advantage was not how it should go. The work was about something. It was about specific gaps in specific systems, gaps with specific human consequences, and the only way to honor what it was about was to find the right context for it, not the fastest one, not the most lucrative one. He got dressed, made coffee, and went to the garage. He didn't look at the business card. He started working on a new section of the framework. a refinement of the predictive modeling algorithm that he'd been circling for 3 weeks without committing to. He worked until Lily got up, had breakfast, and left for school. He worked through the morning. He took a break for lunch, went back to work, and by 3 in the afternoon had something he hadn't expected. A breakthrough, small but clean, in exactly the part of the model he'd been struggling with. He sat back and looked at it. Then he did something he very rarely did. He photographed it, not with any plan, just because when you solve something you've been working on for 3 weeks, you photograph it. You mark the moment. The photograph sat on his phone. He looked at it once, then put the phone back in his pocket and went back to work. He didn't know, sitting there in the yellow light of the back room with the smell of motor oil coming through the walls and the drawings spread around him, that his daughter would see that photograph. He didn't know what Lily was going to do with it. He didn't know that the business card on the workbench was about to become completely irrelevant. He didn't know any of that yet. He just worked. That was what he did. He worked, quietly and carefully and with the kind of focused love that some people put into prayer or music or the raising of children, and outside in the valley, the autumn light faded toward evening, and the smell of dinner would eventually reach him through the door to the house, and his daughter was at her desk in her room doing something he hadn't yet noticed. She was not doing homework. She was at her laptop, looking at engineering forums and professional networks, and the accounts of automotive industry experts, and she was reading comments and assessing reach, and she was building something in her mind with the methodical patience of a person who has been taught, by proximity and by love, how to solve a problem carefully. She was 12 years old, and she had inherited her father's precision and her mother's stubbornness, and she had been watching someone underestimate the person she loved most in the world for as long as she could understand what underestimation meant. She was going to do something about it. Mason made pasta that night. He didn't think about it until he was already cooking it, and then he remembered and looked in the cabinet and found a jar of arrabbiata sauce and some canned artichoke hearts, and managed to make something that was at least 2 steps above plain pasta in a way that satisfied the letter of his promise, if not entirely its spirit. Lily ate it without comment, which was its own kind of commentary. "How was school?" he asked. "Fine." A pause. "We did a thing in science about engineering failures. Bridge collapses, structural stuff. What did you learn?" "That most failures aren't one big mistake. They're a bunch of small decisions that seem reasonable individually and then compound." She twirled pasta. "It made me think about your safety systems." "How so?" "The gaps you're trying to fix. That's the same thing, right? It's not one broken system. It's multiple systems making individually reasonable decisions that don't account for each other." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly right." She nodded, like someone checking a box. "That's what I thought." They finished dinner. He washed the dishes. She dried. This was the division of labor they'd fallen into naturally and had never formally discussed, one of the small domestic logics that organize a household of 2. He went back to the garage after dinner. She went to her room. He worked until midnight. She worked until 11. When he finally went to bed, everything was quiet. In the morning, it would not be quiet. In the morning, his phone would start ringing before he'd finished his first cup of coffee. Different numbers, different area codes, different voices with different accents, all asking some version of the same question, all pulling toward the same impossible, disorienting fact. But he didn't know that yet. He slept. The house was quiet. Outside in the Fresno Valley, the stars were doing what stars do, which is shine without caring whether anyone notices. In her room, Lily Cross had just closed her laptop. She lay in the dark for a while, heart moving faster than usual, running the calculation one more time in her head. The reach, the audience, the quality of what she'd posted, the quality of what she knew it represented. She was 12. She understood that she'd done something she probably should have asked about first. She also understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has watched a quiet injustice for long enough, that some things don't get better if you wait for the right moment to ask. She turned over. She went to sleep. Her father's drawings were already traveling. The phone started at 6:47 in the morning. Mason was on his second cup of coffee, standing at the kitchen counter in the gray early light, still wearing the shirt he'd slept in, and the phone buzzed against the laminate surface with the particular aggressive energy of a device that has been trying to reach you and is losing patience. He looked at the screen. Unknown number, Seattle area code. He let it go to voicemail. It buzzed again 30 seconds later. Different number, same area code. He picked it up this time. Yeah. Is this Mason Cross? The voice was male, rapid, the specific velocity of someone who operates in a world where time is visibly expensive. The engineer, the safety systems work, the integration framework? Mason set down his coffee. Who is this? My name is David Park. I'm a senior engineer at Cascade Automotive Research in Seattle. I'm looking at something right now that was posted to the Auto Engineers Forum last night, and I want to know if it's real. A cold thing moved through Mason's chest. Not quite fear, something adjacent to it. What was posted? He said carefully. Photographs, 12 of them, technical drawings, a unified integration framework for vehicle safety systems, predictive modeling algorithm, sensor fusion architecture. The account that posted them is called, ML Cross_designs. The post says these belong to an independent engineer in California. A pause. Mr. Cross, I've been doing safety systems research for 11 years. What I'm looking at right now is either a very sophisticated hoax or the most significant independent engineering work I've seen in my career. I need to know which one it is. Mason stood very still. Give me 10 minutes, he said. He ended the call. He stood at the kitchen counter for a moment, not moving. Then he walked down the hallway to Lily's room. Her door was closed. He knocked once, which he always did, and then opened it without waiting for an answer, which he almost never did. Lily was awake. She was sitting up in bed with her knees pulled to her chest, and she was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not quite guilty, because guilt implies uncertainty about whether you were right, and Lily clearly did not have that uncertainty. It was something more like braced, like someone who has thrown a stone and is now watching to see where it lands. You posted the drawings, he said. Yes. Last night? Yes. He looked at his daughter. She looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. How? He said, finally. He meant it practically. Not how did you think to do this, but the mechanics of it. I photographed them from the ones on your phone, the ones you took yesterday when you solved the latency thing. And I went back through the workshop when you were sleeping and photographed the rest. The full framework, the sensor array, the predictive model. I posted them to 4 forums and 2 engineering networks. She paused. I made a separate account. I didn't use your name in the username, but I tagged them with your real name in the description. Auto Engineers Forum. That one and 3 others. He sat down on the edge of her bed. The mattress gave under his weight. He rubbed his face with both hands. Lily. I know. Those drawings. I know, Dad. I know they're personal. I know you weren't ready. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something that wasn't quite steady. But she was wrong. That woman who came here, she looked at 6 years of your work and called it a sketch and left. And she was wrong. And nobody was ever going to know she was wrong unless someone did something. A pause. So I did something. He looked at her for a long time. His phone was buzzing again in his hand. I have to deal with this, he said. I know. He stood up. At the door, he stopped and turned back around. We're going to talk about this, he said. Properly, later. I know, she said again. And then quietly, I'm sorry, and I'm not sorry. Both of those things are true. He went back to the kitchen. He did not go to the garage. He sat at the kitchen table with his phone and his coffee and the specific sensation of standing at the edge of something very large, and he started dealing with it. By 8 in the morning, he had returned 6 calls and ignored 11 others. By 9, he had spoken to engineers from 3 different countries. By 10, he had received an email from a professor at MIT's mechanical engineering department who had found the post through a colleague and who wrote in the measured but unmistakable language of genuine excitement that the sensor fusion architecture alone represented a fundamentally new approach to a class of problems that his own research group had been working on for 2 years without arriving at anything comparable. At 10:15, his phone rang with a San Francisco area code that he recognized. He answered it. "Mr. Cross?" Victoria Sterling's voice. Different from the garage, tighter, more careful, stripped of the authority by default quality it had carried when she walked into his space expecting to evaluate him. "I've been made aware of a posting on several engineering forums. So have about 40 other people, apparently." A short silence. "Have you looked at the responses?" "I've been on the phone all morning." "Then you know." Another pause, and in the pause there was something that might, in a different person, have been discomfort. "My engineering team flagged it at 6 this morning. By 7, I had 3 of my senior researchers in my office independently telling me they'd found it. Mr. Cross, the team that has been working on integrated safety systems for the past 3 years, they reviewed your framework." She stopped. "And?" he said. She took a breath. It was not a smooth breath. It was the breath of someone who has been wrong about something significant and is now required to say so out loud. "And they said it's extraordinary," she said. "Not interesting, not promising, extraordinary. The architecture you've designed, the way you've structured the communication framework as the primary layer rather than the integration layer, my lead researcher said it would have taken their team another 3 to 5 years to arrive at that approach, if they arrived at it at all." Mason was quiet. "I made an error," Victoria said. "When I came to your garage, I evaluated what I could see rather than what was there. I looked at the context rather than the content, and that was a mistake." The words came carefully, like someone navigating ice, aware of each footstep. "I wanted to call personally, not to reoffer what I offered before, just to say that." He was quiet for another moment. "I appreciate that," he said. And he meant it, which was complicated, because he also still felt the landing of the word sketch somewhere in his chest, and appreciation and that feeling were sitting in the same space without resolving. "If you're willing to meet again," she said, "under different circumstances. On your terms." "I'll think about it," he said. He ended the call. He sat at the table. Then he got up, went to the garage, stood in front of the back room for a moment, and walked in. The drawings were exactly as he'd left them the night before. He stood at the drafting table and looked at the central framework diagram, and he thought about 40 engineers in Seattle, and a professor at MIT, and 3 senior researchers in Victoria Sterling's office, all looking at the same thing he'd been looking at alone in this room for 6 years. The feeling was difficult to name. It wasn't triumph, it was something closer to vertigo. He heard Lily in the garage doorway. "How bad is it?" she asked. He turned around. She was in her school clothes, backpack on, ready to leave. It was a Wednesday, school started at 8:15, but she was hovering. "It's not bad," he said. "How not bad?" He looked at his daughter. MIT reached out. A professor. 3 senior engineers from Sterling Automotive. David Park at Cascade Research, who apparently sent me a follow-up email while we were talking because he didn't want me to hang up before he could make his case. He paused. "And probably 40 other people I haven't talked to yet." Lily absorbed this. Her expression didn't change dramatically, but something in it settled. The braced quality from this morning releasing slightly, like a held breath let out. "I knew it," she said, not triumphant, just certain. "You're still in trouble," he said. "I know. Not serious trouble, but real trouble." "Okay." "Those drawings were not yours to share without asking." "I know, Dad. I know that." She shifted her backpack. "But you wouldn't have shown them, not on purpose. Not yet. You'd have kept revising them for another 6 years. The accuracy of this was painful in the specific way that things are painful when someone who loves you sees you clearly." "Go to school," he said. She went. He spent the morning reading emails and responding selectively. By noon, he had a clearer picture of the spread. Lily had posted to 4 forums: Auto Engineers, the Global Safety Systems Network, EV Innovation Hub, and a smaller academic forum called Applied Mobility Research Quarterly, which had a smaller audience but a more concentrated one, heavy on PhDs and research engineers. The posts had been shared beyond the forums almost immediately. By midnight, they'd reached industry LinkedIn networks. By 4 in the morning Pacific time, they were being discussed in Slack channels and research group chats in Germany, Japan, South Korea, and the UK. The designs had traveled faster than he would have thought possible, and they'd traveled to exactly the kind of people equipped to evaluate them. And those people, uniformly, were saying the same thing David Park had said on the phone at 6:47 that morning. Around noon, Mason made himself a sandwich and sat at the workbench and tried to think clearly. The problem was not that the work had been seen. He'd known, somewhere, that it needed to be seen. Had known it for a while, had been avoiding knowing it. The problem was the circumstances, the speed, the absence of control. He'd built the work in private for private reasons, and now it was public, and the private reasons were going to get harder to protect. He thought about Sarah. The accident had been on Interstate 80, eastbound, on a November night 3 years after Lily was born. Rain, a lane change by a vehicle whose collision avoidance system had detected a hazard in its lane and steered automatically without accounting for Mason's car in the adjacent lane. A decision made by one safety system without communication with anything else, in a fraction of a second that had changed the geometry of the universe. The official report had called it a systems interaction failure, a known risk category, an area of ongoing research. He had been the ongoing research. He hadn't told many people. He told his sister, who lived in Portland and called every Sunday. He told Gerald Hoyt when he first leased the garage, because Gerald had asked directly why a man with his credentials was fixing cars in Harlow, and Mason had told him the short version, and Gerald had nodded and said nothing further, which was exactly right. He hadn't told Victoria Sterling. He hadn't told David Park. He hadn't told any of the 40 engineers or the MIT professor or anyone else who had called or emailed that morning. The work existed because Sarah was gone. That was the truth of it. The drawings on the walls of the back room were 6 years of trying to do the only thing he knew how to do with the worst thing that had ever happened to him. He didn't know how to make that public. He wasn't sure he wanted to. He ate his sandwich. He went back to the phone. At 2 in the afternoon, he got a call from a man named Hiroshi Tanaka, who was the director of safety systems research at Tanaka Automotive, a Japanese company with a subsidiary in California, and who spoke careful, precise English with the gravity of someone who chooses words the way engineers choose components, for fit and function, not decoration. "Mr. Cross," Tanaka said, "I have spent this morning reviewing your drawings with my team. I will not waste your time with qualifications. Your approach to the communication architecture is correct. We have been working from a flawed premise for several years. Your framework resolves it." Mason said, "Thank you. I want to invite you to our facility in Palo Alto," Tanaka said, "formally, to present your work and discuss potential collaboration. We would cover all arrangements." A pause. "I want to be clear that this is not a recruitment conversation. I'm not trying to acquire your designs. I'm trying to understand them and to begin a conversation about what might be possible. Can I ask how you found the post?" "My daughter sent it to me," Tanaka said, with a brief dryness that suggested he found this slightly embarrassing. "She's at Stanford. She said it was in all the forums and that I should look at it before someone else called me about it." A pause. "She was right. 2 other companies called me about it this morning." Mason looked at the wall of the garage. "Your daughter sent it to you?" "Yes." "Mine posted it." A silence, and then Tanaka said, with a warmth that hadn't been there before, "Ah. Yeah. She must be very certain of your work. She's 12. 12-year-olds can be certain," Tanaka said. "Sometimes that's the most useful perspective available." Mason thought about Lily standing in her bedroom doorway this morning, braced and unrepentant. He thought about the science class lesson about compound failures. He thought about engineering leadership podcasts through the wall. "I'll think about Palo Alto," he said. "Please do," Tanaka said. "There's no urgency. The work isn't going anywhere, and neither are we." This somehow was the right thing to say. After he hung up, Mason sat for a while. The garage was quiet in the afternoon, no clients scheduled today. Outside the window, a crow was doing something investigative to the edge of the gravel lot. The sky was that pale California autumn blue that looks like it's been washed. He went to the back room and looked at the drawings again. 40 people, roughly, had seen them now, possibly more. The forums tracked views, not just responses, and the responses alone numbered in the hundreds. His designs had been seen in a single night by more engineers than he'd spoken to in the past 3 years combined. He felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Not exposure, exactly. Not the vulnerability he'd been dreading for 6 years. Something else. Something that had the quality of a pressure releasing. Slow, steady, not entirely comfortable, but not the catastrophe he'd been bracing for. The drawings were out in the world. They were being read by people who could read them. And those people were saying they were real. He'd known they were real. He'd always known. But there's a kind of solitude that starts to sound like delusion after enough years, and some part of him had not been entirely immune to that. He went back to the workbench and started writing a response to the MIT professor. When Lily came home from school at 3:30, she came directly to the garage, didn't stop at the house, and appeared in the entrance with her backpack still on. "Well?" she said. He looked up from the workbench. "MIT, 3 major automotive companies. Tanaka Automotive wants me to come to Palo Alto. A university in Munich emailed in German, which I can't read, but Google Translate suggests they're interested in the predictive modeling algorithm specifically." She took this in. "That's a lot for one morning. You posted to 4 forums. I thought it would take longer to spread. Engineering forums apparently move fast when someone posts something they haven't seen before." She came in and set her backpack down by her desk. She didn't sit immediately. She stood by the desk with her arms at her sides, and for a moment she looked, very briefly, like the younger version of herself she usually kept carefully managed. Younger and less certain. "Are you angry?" she said. He considered the question honestly, the way she'd always expected him to consider questions. "I was," he said. "This morning, I was not angry, exactly. I was—" He stopped. "Scared. For about an hour. Because those drawings have things in them that I'm not ready for people to know about. The reason for them, where they come from." Lily was quiet. She knew what he meant. She'd always known. "I didn't post that part," she said quietly. "I just posted the designs. I didn't write anything personal. Just independent engineer in California, contact through the account if interested." "I know." He looked at her. "I figured that out about halfway through this morning." "I wouldn't do that," she said. "That's yours." "Yeah." She sat down at her desk. He went back to the email. The garage held its usual smell, its usual light, and for a few minutes neither of them spoke, which was its own kind of language. "Dad?" she said eventually. What are you going to do?" He finished the sentence he was writing, read it over, changed 2 words. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I think I'm going to stop saying no to everything automatically." He paused. Tanaka seemed like a reasonable person. "What about Sterling?" He was quiet for a moment. "She called this morning." Lily's head came up. "What did she say?" "That she was wrong about the designs her engineering team told her." "Did she apologize?" "Sort of." He thought about the careful words, the ice-navigating quality of them. As much as someone like her knows how to. Lily appeared to be processing this. "Is that enough?" "For what?" "To make you want to work with her." He leaned back in the chair. The wood creaked in the way it always did. "I don't know what I want to do with her yet. She moves fast and she measures in market value, and she walked into my garage and dismissed 6 years of work in 40 seconds. But she called to say she was wrong. Yes. That's something. It is something." Lily picked up her pencil. "I think she was probably embarrassed," she said, with the frank assessment of someone who hasn't yet learned to be diplomatic about obvious things. Her own engineers had to tell her she was wrong about something she'd already dismissed. That's not a comfortable position. "No," he agreed. "Doesn't excuse it." "No," he agreed again. "But it might explain why she called herself instead of having an assistant do it." He looked at his daughter. "When did you get so analytical about people?" She shrugged. "Same time I started listening to engineering leadership podcasts." He turned back to the computer. Outside, the afternoon was darkening toward evening, and somewhere a few streets over, a dog was barking at nothing. Normal sounds, normal evening. Almost nothing the same as it had been 24 hours ago. The next 3 days moved at a pace that felt nothing like his life usually felt. His life was deliberate, measured, built on the premise that patience was a kind of engineering. These 3 days were something else, a series of phone calls and emails and decisions that had to be made without the usual time to think them through, because the world, having discovered the work, was not inclined to wait. He spoke to Hiroshi Tanaka again. He spoke to David Park twice more. He spoke to the MIT professor, a woman named Dr. Clara Osei, who turned out to be Nigerian-American, brilliant, and refreshingly direct. On a video call that lasted 90 minutes and ranged from the technical specifics of the sensor fusion architecture to a broader conversation about why integrated safety systems had plateaued in the way they had. She said things that resonated with his own thinking in a way that left him oddly energized. The specific energy of talking to someone who is working on the same problem from a different angle and whose angle illuminates yours. He did not call Victoria Sterling back. He wasn't ready for that conversation. He needed to understand his own position before he could navigate hers. On the second day, something unexpected happened. A journalist contacted him, not an automotive trade journalist, but a technology journalist from a large general interest publication, who had found the forum post through a contact and was asking for an interview. Mason declined. The journalist was polite about it and asked if he could reach out again in a few months, and Mason said he'd think about it, which was the most he could offer. He had the feeling that things were accelerating past the point where he could individually manage each piece. The work was moving through the world with its own momentum now, and he could either find a way to shape that momentum or watch it go where it went without him. On the third day, Lily came home from school and sat at her desk and did her homework without speaking, which was unusual enough that he noticed. "What's wrong?" he asked, around 4:30. She looked up. "Nothing." "Something." She put down her pencil. "Some kids at school found out." He stopped what he was doing. "Found out. About the post. About the designs. Someone's older sibling is in engineering at Fresno State and saw it on the forum and told them, and now some of the kids know." She said it matter-of-factly, but there was something careful in the matter-of-factness. "They think it's cool. Like, several people said it's cool. Marcus Chen said his dad read about it and said I was brave." "Were some of them not cool about it?" A pause. "Jaden Reese said it was a hoax, that I made it up because I was trying to get attention." Mason looked at his daughter. She was looking at the wall past him with the careful expression she used when she was deciding how much of a reaction something deserved. "What did you say to that?" he said. "I said I didn't make it up, and I said that by the time he finished 8th grade, my father's safety systems would probably be in the car his parents drove." She paused. "Which was maybe mean. A little. But accurate. Potentially." He studied her. "Are you okay?" She picked her pencil back up. "I'm fine. I'm just thinking about how things change when people know about them. Like, yesterday, nobody at school knew who my dad was, except that he fixes cars. And today they know, and it's different, and I put that in motion." She looked at her homework. "I don't regret it. I just didn't totally think through all the pieces." He could have said something about that. He didn't. He just said, "Yeah." "Is that what it feels like for you, with all the calls and stuff?" "Pretty much exactly that." She nodded, like a confirmation of a hypothesis. Then she went back to her homework, and he went back to the engine he was supposed to be evaluating, and the garage held its quiet around them. That evening, after dinner, Mason's phone rang with the San Francisco number again. He looked at it for a moment, then he answered. "Ms. Sterling." "Mr. Cross, I wasn't sure you'd pick up." "I'm still deciding if I'm glad I did," he said. It wasn't hostile. It was honest, which was a distinction he hoped she could read. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "Fair enough." And something about the two words surprised him, because they sounded like a person rather than a CEO. "I've spoken to several people this week," he said. "Tanaka, Cascade Research, MIT. People who've looked at the work seriously." "I know. Hiroshi Tanaka called me." A pause. "He said you were thoughtful. He said, and I'm quoting, that you understood what the work was actually about." "What did that mean to you?" "It meant I'd been trying to see the value in the wrong frame," she said. I'd been looking at it as a technology asset. You've been building it as... She stopped. I don't know the right word. A correction, he said, to something that went wrong. She was quiet. I know you have your own answers for what the work is worth commercially, he said. I'm not dismissing those, but the reason the framework is what it is, why the architecture works the way it works, because I designed it around a very specific kind of failure. A failure I watched happen. And that's not a selling point for a pitch deck, but it's the reason the designs are better than anything your team has been building. A long silence. Will you meet with me? She said. Not at the garage, somewhere neutral. I'll come to Fresno if you want. I just want to talk. No portfolio, no business card, no assistant. He looked across the kitchen at the window, where the evening had turned the sky that deep, flat blue of full dark coming in. Friday, he said. There's a diner on Route 41 called Harlow Family. I'll meet you there at 9. I'll be there, she said. He hung up, stood at the window for a minute. Then he went to the garage where Lily was at her desk doing what appeared to be reading, and he stood in the doorway. I'm meeting Sterling on Friday, he said. Lily looked up. Okay, she said. Then, who suggested the meeting? She did. Who picked the location? I did. She nodded slowly, and there was something almost satisfied in it. Good, she said. That's better than last time. He couldn't argue with that. He went to the back room. He looked at the drawings for a while. He thought about what he'd told Victoria. A correction. He turned the word over in his mind. It was the right word and also insufficient, the way the right word usually is for the thing that matters most. He pulled out a clean sheet of paper and started drawing something he'd been thinking about for 2 days. An extension of the predictive model, a refinement that the conversations with Dr. Osei and Tanaka had pointed him toward. He drew carefully, checking his proportions, making notes in the margins. He worked for 2 hours. The drawings were out in the world, and people were reading them, and tomorrow the phone would ring again, and Friday he would sit across from Victoria Sterling in a diner with no assistants and no portfolio, and somewhere up ahead was a decision he hadn't made yet and couldn't entirely see the shape of. But tonight there was paper and pencil and the specific quality of thinking that happens when you've been alone with a problem long enough to know its every corner, and then suddenly you're not alone with it anymore, and the problem looks different because of that. Not smaller, not easier, but different. Like a room you've lived in so long you stopped seeing it, and then someone walks in and looks at the wall you look at every day, and you see it again through their looking. He made a note in the margin, circled a measurement, drew a new line. Outside, the valley was dark and still, and in her room, Lily had finally stopped pretending to read and gone to sleep, and the small house attached to the garage was quiet the way it always was. But the quiet was different now, fuller, somehow, like it was holding more than before. Mason worked until midnight. The drawings kept getting better. Friday came with fog. The Central Valley did this in autumn, pulled a low gray ceiling down over everything, softening the edges of things, making the fields on either side of Route 41 look like they existed slightly out of focus. Mason drove to Harlow Family Diner in his truck, which had a heater that worked on the passenger side better than the driver's side, and he thought about nothing in particular, which was how he knew he was thinking about everything. He arrived 8 minutes early. The diner was the kind of place that had been the same for 30 years by design. Red vinyl booths, laminate tables, a counter with stools, a coffee smell that was baked into the walls at this point and would outlast the building itself. He knew the woman at the counter, Pauline, who'd been working here since before he moved to Harlow, and who brought him coffee without asking because he always ordered coffee, and she had a good memory for simple things. Waiting for someone? She said. Yeah. You want menus? 2. He sat in the corner booth, the one with a sightline to the door and the window both, which was probably not something he needed to think about consciously, but did anyway. He wrapped both hands around the mug. The fog pressed against the window. Victoria Sterling walked in at exactly 9 o'clock. She was different from the garage. The blazer was gone. She wore a dark sweater, jeans, boots that were still expensive, but in a quieter way. No assistant, no portfolio. She'd said no portfolio and she'd meant it. She spotted him, came across the diner without looking around at it the way she'd looked around his garage, and slid into the booth across from him. "The fog came in overnight," she said. "It does that here." Pauline appeared, set a menu in front of Victoria, refilled Mason's coffee without asking. Victoria ordered coffee and looked at the menu briefly and ordered eggs and wheat toast, which surprised him slightly. He'd half expected her to just have coffee on principle. They were quiet for a moment after Pauline left. Not uncomfortable, exactly, but not easy either. The particular quiet of two people who have said something real to each other on the phone and are now working out how to be in the same room. "I looked up your background," Victoria said, "before coming today. Properly this time. And? UC Davis, mechanical engineering, full scholarship, academic achievement award your junior year. You joined Meridian Automotive in Detroit 4 years out of school. You were on the Advanced Safety Systems research team." She paused. "You left after 3 years. The record gets quiet after that." "People leave jobs," he said. "People with your record don't usually leave to fix cars in Harlow." He looked at her steadily. "You said no portfolio. This isn't a portfolio conversation. It feels like one." She put her hands flat on the table. It was a deliberate gesture, he thought, a conscious effort to look like she wasn't building a case. "I'm trying to understand who I'm talking to, not professionally. I already know your work is extraordinary. My team has spent 4 days on it, and they keep finding new things to be impressed by." She paused. "I'm trying to understand why a man with everything that professional record suggests you're capable of spent 6 years in a garage in the Central Valley." "I had reasons." "I imagine you did." He looked at his coffee. The mug had a small chip on the rim that he found his thumb moving to automatically. "I'm not ready to explain the reasons," he said. "Not today." She nodded, and she let it go, which was something he noticed. "Okay," she said. "Then let me tell you what I want to talk about." Pauline brought the eggs. Victoria thanked her, actually looked at her when she did it, which was another thing Mason noticed. People in positions like Victoria's sometimes forgot to look at service workers when they acknowledged them. The fact that she did it without thinking suggested it was real rather than performed. "My team has been working on integrated safety systems for 3 years, Victoria said, breaking a piece of toast. "We have 40 engineers, as I told you before, full simulation capability, an industry-leading testing facility. And what they've produced in 3 years, what I've spent $900 million on, doesn't solve the fundamental problem." "I know," Mason said. "I read your published research before you came to the garage." "Then you know exactly where they went wrong. The architecture. You treated integration as a final step rather than a design premise. You built 12 excellent individual systems and then tried to make them talk to each other, and the conversation is imperfect because the systems were never designed to have it." "Yes." She put down the toast. "What I'm asking, and I want to be clear that I'm asking, not offering, not proposing, just asking, is what it would take for you to consider working with us. Not for us. With us. Bringing your framework into an environment where it can be tested properly and built properly, with the resources it deserves." He was quiet for a moment. "The last time we spoke in your garage," he said, "you told me that ideas don't survive in garages, that they survive in labs." "I know I said that." "Did you mean it?" "At the time, yes. In the way I meant it, that without resources and infrastructure, even good work doesn't get built." "Yes." "It was also condescending. I was saying it to persuade you rather than because it was relevant to you specifically. You'd already been doing serious work without my lab." She looked at him directly. "I was wrong to say it the way I said it, and I was wrong about the sketch comment." He held her gaze. "Why did you say it?" She was quiet for a beat. "Because I came in expecting to see something modest, a clever idea from a clever person working beyond his infrastructure. I was already writing the narrative in my head, and I let that override what I was actually looking at." She paused. "That's a failure of evaluation. It's the kind of mistake I train my team not to make. And I made it." The diner moved around them. A family in the next booth, the sound of something on the griddle, Pauline refilling someone's water. Ordinary Friday morning in Harlow. "I have some conditions," Mason said. She looked at him steadily. "Tell me." The framework stays mine, not intellectually. I understand how corporate development works. I understand licensing and patent structures. But creatively, the design decisions are mine. If your engineers find something that doesn't work in simulation, they bring it to me and I evaluate it, not the other way around. Agreed. He'd expected negotiation on that point. The speed of the agreement made him recalibrate slightly. The application, he said, the technology gets developed for safety, not for market differentiation, not as a premium feature for higher-end vehicles. If it works, it has to be deployable across vehicle categories, including cheap ones. Light. She considered this one longer. That affects the commercial structure significantly. I know. That's why I'm saying it. It doesn't make it a deal breaker. She was thinking out loud. He could see it. Licensing at scale across categories is actually more valuable long-term than premium positioning. It changes the model, but it doesn't necessarily reduce the value. She looked at him. Condition accepted. And the reason for the work, he said. He stopped. Looked at the window. The fog was thinning slightly, the fields becoming more solid. There's a story behind these designs, a reason they exist. I'm not ready to make that public. Not yet. If we work together and that changes, if it becomes relevant or if I decide I want to say it, that's my decision to make, not a PR department's. Victoria held his gaze for a moment. That's not a business condition, she said. That's a personal one. Yes. Then it's not mine to accept or decline, she said. It's yours. It was always yours. He looked at her. There was something in the way she said it, not managed, not calculated, that felt like a person rather than a negotiator. Why are you here? He said. Not hostile, genuinely asking. You have 40 engineers. You have $900 million of infrastructure. You could hire someone to iterate on my framework without me. A good team could get most of the way there within a year. They couldn't, she said flatly. I've thought about that. My lead researcher said the same thing when I floated it. The architecture isn't a set of solutions. It's a way of thinking about the problem. You'd need to understand why every decision was made the way it was made, and those decisions came from somewhere. She looked at him. They came from the specific way you've been living with this problem. You can't reverse engineer that from the drawings alone. He was quiet. Also, she said, and something in her voice shifted, became less certain, which paradoxically made him trust it more. I made a mistake with you, a real one, not just a business error. I walked into someone's work and dismissed it because of how it looked on the outside. I do not like being that person. She paused. I'd like the chance to do it differently. Mason looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked out the window at the fog, which had thinned enough now that you could see the shapes of the oaks at the far edge of the field. I'm not saying yes today, he said. I'm not asking for yes today. I need to talk to my daughter. Something moved in Victoria's expression. She's 12. And she's the reason the drawings are out of the garage, he said. I owe her the conversation. Victoria nodded, and this time the nod was different from the one she'd given at the garage. Less clipped, more considered. She sounds remarkable. She is, he said. She's also grounded for 2 weeks, so don't romanticize it too much. Victoria almost smiled. Not quite, but it reached her eyes, which was further than her face usually let it go. Fair enough? He paid for breakfast, which was a deliberate thing, and she let him do it without comment, and they stood in the parking lot for a few minutes in the cooling fog, not quite finished with the conversation and not quite sure how to end it. The summit, she said. You know about it. The Global Automotive Innovation Summit. March, Chicago. It would be the right venue for presenting the framework, if you decided to. 15,000 attendees, engineers, executives, government regulators, research institutions. The scale of the audience matters for this kind of work because the adoption conversation starts there. That's in 4 months. Yes, that's fast. It is. She looked at him. It's also real. The next summit after this one is 2 years out. And the conversation that's already started, the forums, the calls you've been getting, that has a momentum you can shape now or watch shape itself. He thought about what he'd said to Lily, about finding the right way to shape momentum rather than watching it go where it went without him. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking. She shook his hand, a firm, direct handshake that was nothing like the evaluative quality of their first interaction, and walked to her car, and Mason stood in the fog and watched her go and thought that he still didn't entirely trust her, and also that distrust was not the same as wrong about a person. He drove back to Harlow. Lily was at school. He went to the garage, stood in the back room, looked at the drawings. March, Chicago. 15,000 people. He thought about the last time he'd been in front of a large audience, a conference in Detroit 7 years ago, when he was still at Meridian Automotive, presenting preliminary research on sensor response latency. He'd been good at it. Not comfortable, but good. He'd known his material completely, and that had been enough to carry the presentation past the nervousness. This would be different. This would be bigger and more personal, and the material was not just technical now. It was his life. Whether he said that out loud or not, the people in the room would know the context once the framework was presented, because anyone who understood the problem would understand why someone had spent 6 years solving it this way. He sat down at the drafting table. He pulled out a clean sheet of paper. He started writing notes for a presentation he hadn't agreed to give yet. He worked for 2 hours before he recognized what he was doing, and then he kept working anyway. When Lily came home that afternoon, she found him at the drafting table with 8 pages of notes and 2 revised framework diagrams, and she stopped in the doorway to the back room and looked at all of this. "How was the diner?" she said. "Educational." "Was she different?" "From the garage?" "Yeah, she was." He looked at his daughter. "She accepted all 3 conditions before I finished stating them." Lily's eyebrows went up slightly. "All 3? The framework, the accessibility requirement, and the thing about the reason." She was quiet for a moment, processing. "What's the accessibility requirement?" "If the technology works, it gets developed for all vehicle categories, not just expensive ones." She looked at the notes on the drafting table, then back at him. "What's all this?" "Notes." "For what?" He picked up the top page. "The Global Automotive Innovation Summit, March, Chicago. She wants me to present the framework." Lily stood very still for a moment. Something moved across her face, not surprise exactly, more like arriving at a place she'd been heading toward without knowing where it was. "Are you going to?" she said. "I don't know yet." She came into the room and looked at the notes properly, reading the top sheet with the focused attention she brought to anything engineering related. Her eyes moved down the page. "This is an outline," she said. "Rough one." "For the presentation." "For a potential presentation." She looked at him. "Dad, you wrote an outline." "I know." "You don't write outlines for things you're not going to do." He didn't have an answer for that, because it was accurate. "I need to think about it properly," he said, "which means I need to figure out what I'm actually saying. The technical case is easy. I can make that in my sleep. But this audience isn't going to let an unknown mechanic from Harlow walk up there and present a revolutionary framework without pushing back. They'll have questions, hard ones, and some of those questions are going to get close to the personal stuff. So you have to decide how much you're saying," Lily said. "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment, then she sat down in the corner of the room on the old wooden stool she'd claimed years ago and pulled her knees up and looked at the wall of drawings. "Can I say something?" she said. "You usually don't ask." "This one I'm asking." "Yeah," he said. "Go ahead." She looked at the drawings for another moment before speaking. "I think the reason the work is as good as it is, the reason all those engineers are calling and the MIT professor emailed, isn't just because you're smart. There are a lot of smart engineers. The reason is because you built it around something real, something that actually happened. And that's in the drawings, even if nobody knows it consciously. You can feel it." She paused. "And I think if you go up there and present it as just a technical framework, without any of the real thing, people will appreciate it. But they won't understand why it has to be built. They'll treat it like an interesting innovation instead of something necessary." He looked at his daughter for a long moment. "You're 12, he said. "I know." "You're right," he said. She didn't look pleased about it exactly. She looked like someone who would have preferred to be wrong. The next 6 weeks were the most disorienting of Mason's adult life. and his adult life had included things that set a high bar for disorienting. He said yes to Chicago. He told Victoria by email 2 days after the diner in a message that was 3 sentences long and made no reference to feelings or meaning or the personal history he was still not ready to fully articulate. She responded in 4 sentences, equally direct, confirming logistics and attaching a summit planning contact. And there was something in the mutual terseness that felt like the beginning of a working language. He drove to Palo Alto to meet Hiroshi Tanaka, which was a 6-hour round trip and which he made in a day because Lily had school and he didn't want to leave overnight yet. The Tanaka automotive facility was a different environment from anything he'd been in since Detroit. Clean, serious, the specific atmosphere of a place where engineers have been given permission to do the thing engineers want to do, which is solve problems that matter without being redirected toward problems that sell. Tanaka showed him their simulation lab. Mason spent 3 hours there with Tanaka's 2 senior researchers, walking through sections of the framework, and the conversation was the best technical conversation he'd had in years. Genuinely bilateral, the 2 researchers pushing back on his methodology, and him pushing back on their objections, and everyone arriving somewhere better than where they'd started. On the drive home, he called Lily. "How was it?" she asked. "Good, really good. They have a simulation system that would take 8 months of my work and compress it into 3 weeks. Are you going to work with them?" "Tanaka and Sterling are going to have to figure out how they coexist in this," he said. "That's not my problem to solve, but yes, I think so." "That's 3 partners," Lily said. "You, Sterling, and Tanaka. And Dr. Osai, MIT. A pause. "Dad, I know. That's not a garage project anymore." "No," he said, "it's not." He could hear her processing this through the phone, the particular silence of Lily thinking. "Are you okay with that?" she asked finally. He watched the highway. Dusk was coming in from the east, the sky darkening behind the mountains. "Getting there," he said honestly. The summit preparation consumed most of November. Victoria connected him with a presentation coach named Jerome, who was a former engineer turned communications consultant and who had worked with technical presenters for 2 decades. Jerome was no nonsense in a way Mason appreciated. No soft encouragement, no generic advice. He watched Mason present the technical framework once, took 3 pages of notes, and then said, "The engineering argument is airtight. The problem is you're presenting it like a courtroom defense. You're arguing that it's true instead of showing why it matters." "It matters because it works," Mason said. "It matters because people die," Jerome said. "And you know that differently than anyone else in that room will. That's not a liability. That's your entire authority in front of this audience." Mason was quiet. "I'm not telling you to put your grief on stage," Jerome said more carefully. "I'm telling you that the framework is a technical answer to a human problem, and if you strip out the human problem entirely, you've cut out the thing that makes the answer meaningful." He took that home with him and turned it over for a week. He talked to Lily about it. They were at the kitchen table, late, after dinner, and he told her what Jerome had said. "He's right," she said. "I know he's right." "So what's stopping you?" He looked at his coffee. "Saying it out loud in a room full of 15,000 people means it becomes part of the public story. And right now it's ours. Yours and mine. And I don't know how to share it without it changing into something else." Lily was quiet for a long moment. "It already changed," she said, "the night I posted the drawings. It started being more than just ours then." She looked at him. "I think the question isn't whether to share it. I think the question is whether you share it the way you want to, or whether someone else eventually tells a version of it that isn't right." He looked at his daughter. She was 12 years old, and she understood things that most adults spent decades avoiding. "When did you get this way?" he said. She shrugged. "I was always this way. You just didn't always ask." He started writing a different version of the presentation. Not a confessional, that wasn't the right frame, and it wasn't who he was, but an honest one. He wrote about systems and failure modes and the specific category of accident where safety systems contradict each other. He wrote about what those accidents look like in statistical data. And then he wrote one paragraph, just one, that said, I know what one looks like personally, and that's why this architecture exists. He showed it to Lily. She read it twice. That's enough, she said. That's exactly enough. The weeks compressed. He drove to San Francisco twice, once to review the presentation structure with Victoria's team, once for a technical session with her lead researchers that went 4 hours, and left him genuinely energized in the way that deep technical collaboration sometimes did. Victoria sat in on the second session, mostly listening. She asked 2 questions, both of them sharp and well-placed. He answered them. She nodded and said nothing further. After the session, she walked him to his truck in the parking structure. "You're better in front of engineers than I expected," she said. "How did you expect me to be?" Defensive, protective. People who've worked alone for a long time often can't collaborate. They've built too much of themselves around the work. "I spent 4 years in a corporate engineering team before this," he said. "I know how collaboration works." That's not the same as being willing to do it again after 6 years alone. He thought about that. "No," he said. "It's not." She was quiet for a moment. The parking structure smelled like concrete and exhaust, the specific anonymous smell of every parking structure everywhere. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask?" The accessibility condition, the requirement that the technology be deployable across all vehicle categories. She looked at him. Was that about the accident? Was the other vehicle? Was it not a high-end car? He looked at her steadily. "It was a 4-year-old mid-range sedan," he said. "Good safety rating, adequate systems, not the kind of car that would have had the advanced features that were going into premium vehicles at the time." She held his gaze. "I thought so," she said quietly. "Does it change anything?" "No." She said it without hesitation. It clarifies something about why the condition matters the way it does. He nodded. He got in his truck. She stood in the parking structure as he pulled out, and in the rear-view mirror she looked like something other than a CEO, like a person who has learned something they didn't know before and is still adjusting to the weight of it. He drove back to Harlow. The valley was cold now, December settling in, the oaks along the highway stripped to their bones. He stopped and picked up groceries, real groceries, not pasta. He made chicken with roasted vegetables for dinner, which took longer than pasta, but which Lily ate with the particular quiet satisfaction of someone who's been too polite to mention they were tired of pasta. 2 weeks, she said. Chicago. 2 weeks. Are you ready? He thought about the presentation, the framework, the technical argument, the one paragraph that said everything he was willing to say and nothing he wasn't. He thought about Jerome, who had watched the final rehearsal version 2 days ago and said, "That's it. That's the presentation." He thought about Dr. Osei, who had reviewed the technical sections and sent back an email that said, "In its entirety, this is correct, and it will be recognized as correct. Good luck, though I don't think you'll need it." He thought about Victoria Sterling, who had been different at every meeting from the meeting before, not inconsistent, but evolving, like someone who was used to moving through the world one way and was genuinely trying to learn another way, imperfectly and visibly. He thought about the central integration framework drawing, which was now printed in large format and mounted on the wall of the back room, because during one of the San Francisco sessions, a technician had offered to print it to scale for review purposes, and Mason had been startled, the first time he saw it large, by how complete it looked. "I think so," he said. "You think, or you know?" "Both, at different moments." Lily ate a piece of carrot. "I think you're ready," she said. "I've been watching you work on this for as long as I can remember, and the person who's been working on it lately, in the last 2 months, is different from the person who was working on it alone." "Different how?" She looked at him. "Like you're working toward something instead of away from something." He held that. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "Maybe." The night before he flew to Chicago, he went to the garage alone. Lily was asleep. The house was quiet. He walked through the main bay. The Porsche was gone, replaced by a Subaru Forester belonging to a new client who'd driven from Fresno because someone had told her Mason Cross was worth the drive. He walked past the workbench and through the narrow door and into the back room. The drawings were all there. The originals, hand-done, 6 years of mechanical pencil on paper. The large format prints that the San Francisco technician had produced were at the hotel in Chicago, waiting for him in a cardboard tube. But the originals were here. He stood at the drafting table for a while. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe just to be in the room one more time before it became something different. Because it would become something different. He understood that now in a way he hadn't been sure he understood when this started. The presentation would make the framework public in a way that the forum posts hadn't, complete and contextualized and attached to his name and his face. After Chicago, the back room would still be here, and the drawings would still be on the walls, but the thing they represented would have moved into the world in a way that couldn't be called back. He was ready for that. He thought he was ready for that. On the table there was a photograph. He'd printed it himself a few weeks ago and set it there without entirely deciding to. A small photograph, 3 inches by 5, the kind that looks slightly washed out when you print it at home on regular paper. Sarah, laughing at something off camera, brown eyes exactly the color of Lily's, her hair pulled back in the loose way she'd worn it on weekends. He looked at the photograph for a while. "Okay," he said quietly to the empty room. He turned off the task lights. He walked through the garage dark except for the light leaking under the door from the house. He locked the garage door behind him. In the morning, he would drive to Fresno, catch a flight to O'Hare, take a cab to the hotel where Victoria's team had already set up in a block of rooms on the 18th floor, and 3 days later he would stand at a podium in front of 15,000 people with 30 years of automotive industry between them, and he would explain why the way they'd been building safety systems was wrong, and why his framework was right, and, in one measured paragraph that he had written and rewritten and finally gotten exactly right, why he was the person who built it. He did not sleep much. That was fine. Some things deserved to be felt the night before them. In the morning, he made coffee. He woke Lily, who was staying with his sister for the 4 days he'd be in Chicago, because his sister had driven down from Portland specifically, and had said, over the phone, with the particular older sibling tone she'd had since childhood, "Of course I'm coming, you impossible person. I've been waiting 6 years for something like this to happen." Lily ate breakfast, dragged her overnight bag to his sister's car, and before she got in, turned and looked at him on the porch. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "They're going to hear it," she said. "What you've been building. They're actually going to hear it." He looked at his daughter in the early morning light, and he thought about a photograph on a drafting table, and a highway at night, and 6 years of work that had started as the only thing he knew how to do with grief, and had become this. "Yeah," he said, "they are." She got in the car. He watched it leave. He stood on the porch of the small house attached to the garage in Harlow, California, in the December cold, and he breathed in the air, which smelled of winter coming and dried grass and faintly, always, motor oil. Then he went inside, picked up his bag, and went to catch his flight. O'Hare was everything Harlow wasn't. Mason moved through the terminal with his carry-on and the cardboard tube of large format prints, and the noise hit him the way city noise always did after too long in a quiet place. Not unpleasant, just loud. The specific compression of 10,000 people all moving with purpose in the same enclosed space. He found his cab. The driver took the expressway into the city, and Mason watched Chicago come into focus through the window, the skyline assembling itself out of the flat gray December horizon. And he thought about nothing specific, just let the city arrive. The hotel was downtown, close to the convention center where the summit would run for 3 days starting Saturday. Victoria's team had reserved a block of rooms on the 18th floor, and when Mason checked in, the front desk gave him a key card and an envelope with a handwritten note inside that said, "Dinner tonight, 7th floor, 6 o'clock, informal. V.S." He looked at the note for a moment. Then he went up to his room, set the cardboard tube carefully against the wall, and looked out the window at Lake Michigan, which was doing what Lake Michigan does in December, which is look like the end of the world in the best possible way. Gray, and enormous, and completely indifferent. He sat on the edge of the bed. He was tired from the flight and not tired in any way that sleep would fix. He thought about what came after this. Not the presentation. The presentation he'd made peace with had rehearsed until it was as close to right as it was going to get. After the presentation. The applications and the offers and the decisions that would require answers, not holding patterns. He'd been living in a holding pattern for 6 years, and the holding pattern was ending. and he wasn't entirely sure what the terrain looked like on the other side. He showered, changed into clothes that were cleaner than his usual without being what he'd have called formal: dark trousers, a gray shirt, a jacket that his sister had made him buy 2 weeks ago by simply showing up with it and saying, "You're wearing this in Chicago." He went down to the 7th floor at 6 o'clock. The room was a private dining space, hotel standard but arranged for a working dinner. A long table, papers and laptops already distributed around it, people he mostly recognized standing in the clusters that form before food arrives. Dr. Clara Osei from MIT, who was shorter than he'd expected from their video calls and who greeted him with a handshake that meant business and said, "I've been looking forward to this," in a way that made it a statement of fact rather than a pleasantry. Hiroshi Tanaka, who shook his hand and asked about the drive to Fresno Airport and whether the fog had cleared, which was the kind of detail remembering that Mason had come to understand was characteristic of the man. Two of Victoria's senior researchers, both of whom he'd worked with in the San Francisco sessions, and who fell into technical conversation with him almost immediately. Victoria was at the far end of the room, talking to a man Mason didn't recognize, 50s, the bearing of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in rooms. She caught Mason's eye, held up one finger, a minute, and finished the conversation, and then crossed the room. "You made it," she said. "Was there a version where I didn't?" "There's always a version where something goes wrong with travel." She looked at him briefly, assessing. "How are you feeling?" "Fine," he said. "That's not an answer." "It's the honest one. Fine covers a lot of ground." She almost smiled. He'd noticed that about her over the past week, so the almost smiles, the expressions that got most of the way there and stopped. Not from coldness, but from a kind of habitual restraint that he thought had probably been useful to her and was also probably lonely. "The man I was talking to when you came in," she said. "Richard Holt. He's the CEO of Arcadian Motors, third largest automotive company in North America. He's going to be in the front row on Saturday." "Is that meant to make me nervous?" "I thought you should know who's in the room." "I know the framework," he said. "I'll be fine with whoever's in the room." She looked at him. "Richard Holt is going to be the person who pushes back hardest," she said. "He's been in this industry for 30 years, and he does not respond well to someone from outside the mainstream research ecosystem telling him his teams have been approaching a problem wrong." "Has he seen the drawings?" "His engineering team has. They've been careful in what they've said to him about them." "Careful meaning?" "Meaning they recognize the framework is correct and they're not sure how to tell their CEO that a mechanic from Central California got there ahead of their 100-person safety research division." Mason nodded slowly. "Okay. Okay," she repeated like she was checking whether he understood the weight of it. "Ms. Sterling," he looked at her directly, "I've known the framework was correct for 6 years. I don't need Richard Holt to confirm that, and I don't need to manage his ego about it. I need to explain this work clearly enough that the people in that room who can move it forward understand why it matters. That's what I'm going to do." She held his gaze for a moment. "Right," she said. Then again, quieter. "Right." They ate dinner. The conversation moved between technical detail and logistics. Who would introduce Mason at the presentation, the order of the summit panels, the question of media access that Victoria and her communications director kept circling back to. Dr. Osei asked Mason 3 questions that were among the most technically precise questions anyone had asked him, and he answered all 3, and she wrote something in the small notebook she carried and said "good" and moved on, which he found somehow more satisfying than elaborate praise. Around 8:30, Tanaka came to stand beside him at the window with the lake view and said very quietly, "Are you prepared for what happens after Saturday?" "What do you mean?" "I mean that the framework will not be an engineering theory after Saturday. It will be a public commitment. People will move fast once you've presented it in this context. Corporations, regulators, academic institutions. The pace will be difficult." "I know." "You have been setting your own pace for 6 years," Tanaka said. "This is different." Mason looked at the lake. "I know that too." "I raise it not to discourage you," Tanaka said. But because I want you to know that Tanaka Automotive's offer stands at whatever pace is right for the work. We are not interested in rushing the framework into something it isn't ready to be. We are interested in what it actually is. Mason looked at him. Tanaka was in his early 60s, serious in the particular way of someone whose seriousness came from caring deeply about the same thing for a very long time. I appreciate that, Mason said. Your daughter posted the drawings, Tanaka said. It wasn't a question. Yes. How old did you say she was? 12. Tanaka was quiet for a moment. My son told me about the forums at 6 in the morning, he said. My daughter sent me the link. 12-year-olds and adult children. They see the same thing. He looked at Mason. They see when something is being held back that shouldn't be. Mason had no answer for that. He just stood at the window with Tanaka and looked at the December lake, which was still out there being enormous and indifferent, doing what it always did. The next 2 days were preparation and waiting, which was its own specific kind of difficult. He went over the presentation twice more with Jerome, who had flown in and who watched the second run-through and said, "Stop rehearsing, you're going to sand the texture off it," and sent him away to do something that wasn't presentation-related. He walked along the lakefront for an hour in the cold, which helped. He called Lily, who was at his sister's in Portland and who said school was fine, and his sister had made her try Ethiopian food and it was excellent, and also she'd been looking at the summit's website and reading about the attendee list. Richard Holt is going to be there, she said. How do you know about Richard Holt? I read about him. He's been publicly skeptical about integrated safety architecture as a regulatory priority. He testified in front of a Senate committee 2 years ago against mandatory implementation timelines. A pause. He's going to be the loudest voice in the room pushing back. Victoria said the same thing. Victoria's right. Another pause. Don't let him rattle you, Dad. He's been wrong about this for 2 years officially and probably longer unofficially. His own engineers know it. You just have to give them something solid enough to stand behind when they go back to him after the presentation. He stood on the lakefront with the wind coming off the water and smiled. Not almost, actually smiled. When did you start following Senate committee testimony? He said. Since this started mattering, she said simply. He slept reasonably well Friday night, which surprised him. He'd expected to lie awake with the presentation running in his head, but instead he fell asleep quickly and woke at 5:30, feeling, if not rested, then at least present. He lay in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the city outside, and then got up and made coffee with the room's machine, and sat at the small desk and looked over his notes one last time. Not to rehearse, just to remember who he was when he wrote them. The convention center was enormous in the way that places built to contain an entire industry have to be. A vast atrium, escalators moving people between levels, the particular atmospheric pressure of a lot of very smart people in one building who are all there because they care about the same problem. Mason arrived with Victoria's team at 8, 3 hours before his presentation slot, and walked the main hall once before the crowds arrived. The stage was large, larger than he'd expected, with a screen behind it that would take his slides and scale them to 15 feet high. There was a podium. There was a microphone. He stood at the edge of the stage alone for a few minutes, with the hall empty and the lights at pre-show levels, and he just looked at it. Jerome appeared beside him. Don't do the thing where you stand here and imagine it full, he said. I wasn't. You were. I was looking at the slide dimensions. Sure you were. Jerome handed him a bottle of water. Eat something. You haven't eaten. I had coffee. That's not something. He ate a granola bar from the green room, which was what they called the holding area behind the stage, and which was occupied by a rotating cast of presenters and industry figures throughout the morning. He spoke briefly to a German engineer named Klaus, who was presenting on battery architecture and who was visibly more nervous than Mason and who seemed somehow reassured by Mason's relative composure, which Mason found faintly funny. Victoria came to the green room at 10:15. 30 minutes, she said. I know. She looked at him for a moment. The front row includes Holt, 3 federal safety regulators, 2 insurance industry representatives, and the editorial director of Auto Engineering International. That's a lot of front row. It usually is. She paused. I'll be introducing you. He looked at her. You don't usually do the introductions. That's a moderator job. I'm doing this one. She said it in a way that closed the conversation. Is there anything you need? No. She turned to go. He said, Victoria. She turned back. Thank you, he said, for coming to the garage, even the first time. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her face. Not sentimentality, she wasn't built for sentimentality, but something real. I should have looked harder the first time, she said. Yeah, but you came back. She held his gaze. Then she nodded and went back out to the hall. The 30 minutes passed the way time passes when you stop watching it. Suddenly he was at the side of the stage, and the hall was full, and the sound of 15,000 people settling was like weather. Jerome stood beside him and said nothing, which was the right thing. Victoria walked onto the stage and the room settled further. She spoke without notes, which Mason noticed. She talked about the state of automotive safety, the progress made, the lives saved by the technologies currently deployed, and then the plateau, the gap between what the systems could do individually and what they failed to do when they interacted. She was precise and she was honest, and she was, he realized, better at this than he'd have expected. Not in the polished way of someone performing competence, but in the way of someone who had been thinking seriously about the problem and was now saying what she actually thought. The person I'm about to introduce, she said, is someone I misjudged. I want to say that directly because it matters to how I say the rest. A pause. The hall very quiet. I went to his workspace 8 weeks ago expecting to evaluate a local mechanic who had some interesting ideas. What I found was engineering work that my 30-year research team could not have produced. I didn't see that at first because I was looking at the context instead of the content. Another pause. That was a failure of attention. I've tried to learn from it. She looked toward the side of the stage. Mason Cross. He walked out onto the stage. The applause was polite. The audience didn't know who he was yet. They were responding to the introduction rather than the person, which was fine. He reached the podium. He set down his water. He looked at the room. 15,000 people. The front row, as advertised. He could see Richard Holt immediately. A large man with the specific stillness of someone who has decided to be skeptical before the first word is spoken, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral in the way that neutral is sometimes a form of aggression. He looked past the front row. The middle sections, the upper tiers, the faces he couldn't individually resolve but could feel as a collective presence. Engineers, executives, researchers who had been working on pieces of this problem for years. He began. He started with the technical case, the way he always planned to, the architecture of the problem, the established research, the specific class of failure that integrated safety systems were still producing despite decades of development. He spoke without looking at notes because he didn't need notes, because this was 6 years of his thinking and he knew it the way you know a room you've lived in. The slides behind him showed the framework clearly, the large format versions of his drawings, now translated into clean digital presentation form without losing the essential structure of the hand-drawn originals. He could feel the room paying attention, not polite attention, actual attention. The quality of it changed as he moved deeper into the technical argument, becoming denser, more concentrated. He could see people leaning forward. He explained the architecture. He explained why the communication framework had to be primary rather than secondary. He walked through the sensor fusion approach, the predictive modeling layer, the response latency solution. He did it clearly and thoroughly and without apology, because it was right, and he knew it was right, and the room was increasingly understanding that it was right, and you don't apologize for right. 20 minutes in, Richard Holt uncrossed his arms. Mason noticed. He kept going. At 25 minutes, he reached the section Jerome had helped him with, the section that wasn't technical. He paused for a moment before it. Just a moment. I want to say something about where this framework came from, he said. Not because the personal context validates the engineering. The engineering stands on its own, but because I think it matters for understanding what the work is actually trying to do. The room was completely still. Vehicle safety systems fail at the integration layer, he said. We know this. The industry has known it for years. The solutions have been incremental because the way we frame the problem has been incremental. We keep optimizing individual systems and treating their interaction as a secondary concern. He paused. I know what a systems interaction failure looks like outside a simulation environment. I know it personally, and that knowledge is the reason this framework exists, not as a technology asset, not as a market opportunity, but as an answer to something that should not have been possible to happen. He didn't say more than that. He didn't need to. He'd learned from Jerome, from Lily, from the weeks of rewriting, that one paragraph, exactly right, was more than enough. He moved back to the technical conclusion. He finished the presentation. He said, "The framework is ready to be built. The question is whether this industry is ready to build it differently than it's built everything else, from the architecture out, rather than from the features in." He stepped back from the podium. The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Then Richard Holt stood up. Mason watched him. The room watched him. Holt was not standing to applaud. He was standing to speak, which was not protocol, but nobody in that room was going to tell Richard Holt about protocol. "Mr. Cross," Holt said, his voice carried without a microphone. "I have a question." "Go ahead," Mason said. "Your integration framework, the communication primary architecture, you've demonstrated the mathematical modeling, but mathematical modeling and real-world performance are different environments. What makes you certain this holds outside theoretical conditions?" It was a fair question. It was also, Mason thought, the most defensible version of skepticism available to someone who had seen the framework and couldn't find a technical objection. "The modeling has been reviewed by Tanaka Automotive's simulation team in Palo Alto," Mason said, "by Dr. Clara Osei's research group at MIT, and by your own engineers, Mr. Holt, who reviewed the posted design 6 weeks ago and provided a written assessment to your research director." He paused. "I'd refer you to that assessment." The hall went very quiet. Holt's expression shifted. Not dramatically. He was too experienced for dramatic shifts, but it shifted. "My engineers reviewed the forum post," he said. "Yes. And their assessment was that the framework was technically sound and represented an approach they hadn't considered. I believe the word they used was significant." Mason looked at him. "I'm happy to be wrong about what they said, but I don't think I am." Another silence. Then, from the third row, a woman he didn't recognize, 50s federal agency badge, said, "Mr. Cross, what does deployment look like? Timeline and cost across vehicle categories?" And the room opened up. Not a standing ovation, not yet, but a release of something, like the moment in a complex calculation when the numbers start resolving toward an answer everyone in the room has been hoping for and not quite daring to believe was there. He answered the question, then another, then 6 more, from 6 different corners of the hall, and he answered all of them, and the answers were correct, and the room knew they were correct, and that was enough. That was more than enough. Holt sat down at some point during the questions. When the moderator called time on the Q&A, the applause that came was not polite. It was real, the specific sound of a room that has just seen something it didn't know it needed to see. Mason stood at the podium and let it exist for a moment without trying to manage it or interpret it. Just let it be what it was. Backstage, Jerome handed him a water bottle and said, "That's the presentation," in the flat tone of someone who has seen enough presentations to know the difference between a good one and a defining one. Victoria was there too. She didn't say anything immediately, just stood in the controlled noise of the backstage area while other presenters moved around them and looked at him with an expression that was more open than he'd seen her face carry before. "Holt's people have already called our communications director," she said. "I figured. He's going to want a meeting." "I figured that too." "You called him out in front of 15,000 people," she said. It wasn't a reprimand. It was close to impressed. "I stated facts," he said. He had the choice of how to respond to them. He chose to sit down, which is the most dignified option he had. She looked at him. "He'll respect that you didn't twist the knife." "I didn't say it to twist anything. I said it because it was accurate and because the room needed to know that the framework had already been reviewed by the people who were going to pretend they hadn't seen it." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "That's who you are." He wasn't sure exactly what she meant by that. but it didn't feel like criticism. The rest of the day was a sustained and exhausting series of conversations that he hadn't entirely planned for, even though logically he should have. Engineers who found him in the corridors between sessions, research directors who sent assistants to ask if he had 10 minutes, 3 people who had seen the forum post and tracked it back to Lily's upload and asked whether the 12-year-old who'd posted it was really his daughter. He said yes. 2 of them said they were going to tell that story to their own kids. At some point in the afternoon, he found a quiet corner near a window in one of the secondary halls and called Lily. Portland was 2 hours behind, and she was home from school already. "How did it go?" she said. He could hear from her voice that she'd been waiting for the call. "Richard Holt stood up in the middle of the room to challenge me," he said. A sharp intake of breath. And I told him his own engineers had already reviewed the framework and their assessment was that it was significant. Silence. "Dad?" she said. "Yeah. That's—" She stopped. He could hear her thinking. Did he back down? He sat down. Another silence, longer. And then Lily laughed. A real laugh. The one she usually kept under careful management. The one that sounded like her mother's laugh in the specific pitch and timing. It only lasted a few seconds, but it was real. "Okay," she said when she got it under control. "Okay, that's good. That's really good. Dr. Osei said hello. She wants to talk to you at some point." "To me?" "I mentioned you reviewed the accessibility condition argument. She said anyone who thinks about engineering ethics at 12 deserves a conversation." A pause, and then quietly, "Okay." "She's not going to quiz you. She just wants to talk." "I know. Another pause. "Okay." He stood at the window with the phone and the winter light coming off the lake, and he thought about how it had started. A phone ringing at 6:47 in the morning, David Park's voice, the cold thing moving through his chest. 8 weeks from that morning to this one. A distance that felt, from inside it, much longer and also somehow abrupt, like the difference between a slow fire and the moment it catches. "Are you okay?" Lily said. "Yeah," he said. "I'm actually okay." "Good," she said. Then, "I'm glad I posted them." "I know you are." "Are you glad?" He looked at the lake. The light was going, the way it went fast in December, the gray deepening toward the early dark. "Yeah," he said. "I'm glad." The evening was a summit reception that he went to for an hour before finding a polite exit, because there are limits to how much prolonged social performance is reasonable to ask of a man who has been alone in a garage for 6 years. He ate dinner by himself at a diner 3 blocks from the hotel, at a counter, in the comfortable anonymity of someone in a city where nobody knows your face, and he ate a burger and drank coffee and thought about nothing specific in the specifically useful way that tired people sometimes manage. He went back to the hotel and found 2 notes under his door, one from Richard Holt's assistant, requesting a meeting at his earliest convenience, and one handwritten on hotel stationery in handwriting he didn't recognize that turned out to be from a federal transportation safety official named Margaret Chen, who wrote that she had been working toward mandatory integration standards for 3 years and had been told repeatedly by industry that the technology wasn't ready, and who wanted to talk about what ready looked like. He set both notes on the desk. He looked at them for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and sent Victoria a text. Chen and Holt both left notes. "What does tomorrow look like?" She responded in under 2 minutes. "Full, good full. Get some sleep." He almost texted back something about how that was easier said than accomplished, but he put the phone down and turned off the light and lay in the dark listening to the city, and he thought about the presentation, the one paragraph, the way the room had gone completely still when he said it. He thought about Margaret Chen's note, the word ready. The specific frustration of someone who has been told a thing isn't ready by people with a financial interest in it not being ready. He thought about Lily saying working towards something instead of away from something. He thought about a small garage in Harlow, California, where the smell of motor oil had soaked into the walls, and a corkboard full of drawings waited in a back room with a photograph on the drafting table and a chip on the coffee mug rim. He fell asleep. He slept for 7 hours, which was more than he'd slept in one stretch in weeks. In the morning, there were 11 emails and 4 voicemails, and he dealt with them over coffee at the desk before going down to the 19th floor, where Victoria had set up a working space for the summit's second day. She was already there when he arrived, coffee in hand, looking at a laptop screen with the focused expression she wore when she was reading something that required decision-making. She looked up when he came in. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than expected." "Good. Holt wants a meeting at 2. Chen wants one at 11. I'd do Chen first. She's the more important conversation long-term, even if Holt's the louder one." "Agreed." He poured himself coffee. "What do we want from the Holt meeting?" Not to embarrass him further, to give him a path into the framework that looks like a choice rather than a concession. She looked at him. He's going to be a significant voice in how fast this gets adopted as a standard. If he leaves Chicago feeling like he lost something, he slows us down. If he leaves feeling like he's part of something, he speeds us up. "You're asking me to manage his ego." "I'm asking you to let me manage his ego while you answer his technical questions honestly." She looked at him over her coffee. "Division of labor." He considered that. "That I can do." She nodded. "Chen first. She's been fighting for mandatory integration standards for 3 years with no technical ammunition. We're giving her ammunition." The meeting with Margaret Chen lasted 90 minutes and was the best conversation Mason had in Chicago. Direct, specific, focused entirely on what the framework meant for regulatory standards and what a realistic timeline looked like for the kind of testing protocol that would satisfy federal requirements. Chen was sharp and experienced and completely uninterested in corporate positioning, which made her easy to talk to. She asked hard questions, and she listened to the answers, and she took notes on an actual legal pad and actual pen, and at the end she said, "This is what we've needed. Not a better version of what exists, a different premise." "That's what it is," Mason said. "How long to get from framework to testable prototype?" He looked at Victoria, who was sitting across the table. 18 months with full resources, he said. Tanaka has simulation capacity that compresses a lot of the early stage work. 18 months, Chen said. She wrote it down. And you're confident the framework holds at scale? The mathematical modeling holds. The simulation will confirm it, yes. She looked at him for a moment with the specific expression of someone who has been promised things before and knows how to assess the difference between a promise and a commitment. I'll hold you to that, she said. Good, he said. The Holt meeting was different. Holt arrived with 2 people, a lawyer and an engineer, which was itself a kind of answer about how he'd decided to approach it. Victoria managed the opening, setting a frame that made space for Holt to engage without having to perform a retraction. Mason watched her do it and understood what she was doing and recognized it as its own kind of skill. The engineering of a room, the construction of conditions where a necessary conversation can actually happen. Holt's engineer asked the technical questions. They were the right questions. Smart, detailed, the questions of someone who had been thinking about the framework since they first saw it and had been building a list. Mason answered all of them. By the end of 30 minutes, the engineer was leaning forward and asking follow-ups, and Holt was watching his own engineer with an expression Mason recognized. The specific expression of a person watching someone they trust get convinced of something they themselves haven't yet decided to be convinced of. At the end of the meeting, Holt shook Mason's hand. His grip was firm and his eye contact was direct, and he said, I was wrong to dismiss this. I'd like to find a way to be part of the solution. It wasn't an apology. It was something more useful than an apology. It was a decision. I'd like that too, Mason said. After Holt left, Victoria closed the door and stood in the empty meeting room for a moment. That's 3, she said. Holt, Chen, and Tanaka. And MIT, and Cascade Research. She looked at him. Mason, do you understand what's been built in the last 48 hours? He sat down in one of the chairs. The exhaustion was real now, the kind that comes after you've held yourself at a sustained high pitch for too long. I understand it conceptually. We have regulatory interest, industry buy-in, independent academic validation, and international partnership all in 2 days. She sat down across from him. This doesn't happen. Not at this speed, not around independent work. It happened because the work was ready, he said. The speed is because it was already out there. Lily posted it 6 weeks ago, and the conversations had already started. Chicago was the moment where it formalized. She looked at him. When do you go back? Tomorrow morning. To Harlow. That's where my daughter is, he said, and my garage. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her thinking, not calculating, he'd learned to tell the difference, actually thinking. I've been considering a proposal, she said. I've been considering it since the diner on Route 41. I wanted to wait until after the presentation because I didn't want the context to be pressured. She looked at her hands briefly, then back up. I'd like to propose something different from a standard corporate development partnership. He waited. An independent center, she said, not a sterling automotive facility, a separate entity, autonomous, structured around the framework and the problem, rather than around any company's commercial interests. I fund it, substantially, but I don't control it. The governance is independent. You have creative authority. The mandate is safety, full category deployment, what we said at the diner. She paused. It attracts people who want to do this work for what it is, not for what company it benefits. He looked at her steadily. Why? He said. Because the corporate structure will slow it down and compromise it, she said simply. I know my own institution. I know what happens when something like this goes through normal development channels. It gets valuable, and it gets protected, and it gets positioned, and it stops being what it is. She held his gaze. I don't want that to happen to this. He was quiet for a long moment. You'd fund something you don't control, he said. Yes. That's not how you've run your career. No, she said. It isn't. She didn't add anything to that, which was the most honest thing she could have done. I need to think about it, he said. I know. And I need to talk to Lily. She nodded. She's 12, she said, and you take her counsel. She's 12 and she understands what the work is about, he said, and she's the reason any of this happened. So, yes. Victoria looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression was close to what he'd describe, if pressed, as respect. Not the professional kind, which she'd had since her engineers made their assessment, but a different kind. The kind that has something personal in it. Tell me what she says, Victoria said. He flew home the next morning. Chicago was still dark when the cab took him to O'Hare, the city lights reflecting off the lake in the pre-dawn quiet, and he sat in the back of the cab and felt the strange particular feeling of returning to something. Not the same thing he'd left, because you never return to the same thing, but to the place where the thing he was building actually lived. His sister met him at Fresno Airport with Lily, which he hadn't expected. He'd thought they'd be waiting at the house, but instead there they were at the arrivals level, his sister looking characteristically unimpressed by airports, and Lily standing beside her with her arms at her sides, watching the sliding doors. He came through the doors, and she looked at him for a moment and then walked toward him at the specific pace of a 12-year-old who has decided it would be undignified to run, but who is not precisely walking either. He put his arms around her, and she leaned into it without comment, which was its own kind of comment. How was Portland? He said, into the top of her head. Cold. The Ethiopian restaurant was good. Your sister made me watch an old movie. Which one? Something with cars and racing. She said you'd know it. Probably. His sister clapped him on the shoulder from behind, hard enough to be felt through the jacket. You look exhausted, she said. Also, the summit is all over the engineering news channels, so you should probably expect the phone to start again. I know. Also, Lily spent 2 days telling me everything about the framework, which means I now know significantly more about vehicle safety integration architecture than any graphic designer should ever have to know. I can stop, Lily said. Don't stop, his sister said. I'm just saying. They drove back to Harlow in his sister's rental car, and the Central Valley in the early morning was flat and cold and exactly itself, and Mason sat in the passenger seat and watched it go by and felt, underneath the exhaustion, something he'd been working toward for a long time without having a clear name for it. Not peace exactly. Something more active than peace. He thought about the independent center, the structure of it, the mandate, the governance, the kind of engineers it could attract, the ones who wanted to do the work rather than the ones who wanted to do the work for a particular company's benefit. He thought about Tanaka and Dr. Osai, and Margaret Chen with her legal pad. He thought about the framework on the giant screen behind him, 15 feet high, all the years of it visible at once. He thought about what Lily would say when he told her about the proposal. He already had a reasonable idea of what she'd say. She'd want the details first. She always wanted the details before the conclusion. She'd ask about governance structure and what independent actually meant contractually. She'd ask about the accessibility mandate and whether it was enforceable. She'd ask something he hadn't thought to ask that would turn out to be the most important question, and then she'd probably say, "I think you should do it." In the flat, certain way she had when she'd thought something through completely and arrived at a conclusion she trusted. He wasn't going to tell her what to say. He was going to tell her the proposal and ask what she thought, the way he always did. The way they'd figured out together was how their household worked. Two people who told each other the truth and took each other seriously, one of whom happened to be 12 and one of whom happened to be 32, and both of whom were still figuring out what came next. The garage appeared on the right side of the road as they came into Harlow, and he saw it the way you sometimes see a familiar thing after an absence, clearly the way you can't usually see it when you see it every day. Small. Modest. The gravel lot with its patches of dried grass at the edges, the two west-facing windows, the sign above the door that said Cross Auto in faded paint that he'd been meaning to repaint for 2 years. His sister pulled into the lot. The three of them got out. The December air was cold and thin and smelled of nothing particular. Lily stood looking at the garage for a moment. Then she said, "It looks the same." "It is the same," he said. She looked at him. "Everything else is different." He stood in the gravel lot of the small garage in Harlow, California, with his overnight bag and the cardboard tube of prints and his 12-year-old daughter standing beside him, and he thought, "Yes." "Yeah," he said. "It is." He unlocked the garage door. The smell hit him. Motor oil and metal and the older thing underneath, years of quiet work absorbed into the walls. He walked through the main bay, past the Subaru Forester waiting for its next session, through the narrow door into the back room. The drawings were on the walls and on the table, exactly as he'd left them. The photograph was on the drafting table, small and slightly washed out, exactly as he'd left it. He set down the cardboard tube. He stood at the table for a moment. Then he sat down, pulled out a new sheet of paper, and started writing notes about an independent center, what the structure would need, what the mandate required, what the governance had to protect. He wrote for 20 minutes, just getting it out of his head and onto paper, the way you do when something has been taking shape in your mind and needs to be outside of it before you can see it clearly. Lily appeared in the doorway. She looked at the page he was writing on. "What's that?" she said. "Something Victoria proposed," he said. "I want to tell you about it." She came in and sat on her stool in the corner, the one she'd claimed years ago, and she pulled her knees up and looked at him with her mother's eyes that didn't miss anything. "Tell me," she said. He told her. Lily listened to all of it without interrupting, which was how she listened when something mattered enough to deserve her full attention. Mason told her about the proposal the way he'd written about it on the paper, not with enthusiasm designed to persuade her, but with the plain structure of it. An independent center, Victoria's funding, autonomous governance, creative authority in Mason's hands, the mandate locked to safety, and full category deployment, the same terms from the diner on Route 41, now formalized rather than conditional. He told her it would need a location, staff, a legal structure that protected its independence from any single corporate interest. He told her Victoria had said she didn't want to control it, and that he believed her, and that believing her was its own kind of risk that he was willing to take with his eyes open. When he finished, Lily was quiet for a moment, looking at the wall of drawings. "Where would it be?" she said. "That's not decided. Somewhere with access to engineering talent. Bay Area, probably. Maybe Austin." "Not Harlow." "No, Harlow is too far from everything it would need." She nodded slowly. "What happens to the garage?" He looked at her. He hadn't expected that to be the first real question. "The garage stays," he said. "It's ours. I'd still have it." "But you wouldn't be here." "Not every day." "No." She looked at her knees. He watched her process this, not the abstract version of the proposal, but the specific version that included them, their life, the routine that had held the two of them steady for 6 years. He hadn't rushed her toward a reaction, and he didn't rush her now. "Is this what you want?" she said finally. He thought about the honest answer, which was more complicated than yes or no. "I want the framework to become what it should be," he said. "An independent center is the structure that gives it the best chance of that without getting eaten by corporate priorities." He paused. "And I think I'm ready for it. To be back in that kind of environment. On my terms this time, not someone else's." She looked at him. "What about the personal stuff? The reason for the work? You said one paragraph in Chicago. Is more of that going to come out?" "Probably, at some point," he said. "I can't control what people piece together, but I can control how I tell it, and when, and in what context." He held her gaze. "That's still ours, Lily. It doesn't become public property just because the work does." She was quiet again. Then she said, "What does Victoria get out of this? If she's funding it and not controlling it, what's her return?" "She says the long-term licensing value across vehicle categories is more significant than any premium positioning would be, which is probably true." He paused. "She also says she wants to do something that isn't measured only by what her company earns from it." Lily's expression was the one she wore when she was deciding whether to believe something. "Do you believe that?" "I believe she means it right now," he said carefully. "I think she's a person who's been running hard toward one definition of success for her whole career, and she's 30 years old and she's starting to think about what the definition should actually be. Whether that holds over time," he stopped. "I don't know. That's a risk I'd be taking." She looked at the photograph on the drafting table, the small, slightly washed-out photograph that had been there for weeks now. She looked at it the way she rarely let herself look at it, directly, without the careful management. "Mom would have thought this was right," she said. Not a question. "Yeah," he said. "She would have." Lily set her chin on her knees. "Then do it," she said. "But do it like you did Chicago, on your terms, with the conditions written down and signed, not just agreed to in a diner." "Obviously. And I want to read the governance documents before you sign anything." He looked at his 12-year-old daughter. "You want to read the governance documents?" "I read the legal structure of 2 nonprofit research entities last week," she said, "for context." He sat with that for a moment. "You're very strange," he said, with something in his voice that wasn't quite any single emotion, but was located somewhere near the intersection of proud and grateful, and still, underneath it all, the specific grief of a man who sees his late wife's mind operating in their child every single day. "I know," Lily said. "So are you." He called Victoria that evening. She answered on the second ring, which suggested she'd been waiting, which he'd expected. "She said yes," Victoria said, before he could open with anything. "She said do it, get it in writing, and she wants to read the governance documents." A pause. "She's 12. "You keep saying that like it changes what she said." A short sound that might, in a different conversation, have been a laugh. "All right. I'll have the legal team start drafting the independent entity structure. It'll take 4 to 6 weeks to do it properly." "Do it properly," he said. "Don't rush it to make it fast and then find problems in it later." "I know how to structure a legal entity, Mason." "I know you do. I'm saying it anyway." "Fair enough." A pause. "There's one more thing I want to propose, and I want to be clear, this is separate from the center." "Go ahead." The summit generated significant media interest. Several publications want to cover the framework, properly, not just the technical summary. There's an Auto Engineering International profile, which is the right trade context. And there's a general interest publication, larger audience, that wants to write about the human side of it. She paused carefully. "I told both of them I'd pass the request on. It's your call." He was quiet for a moment. "The general interest one," he said. "The human side piece." "Yes." He thought about what Lily had said in the back room months ago, in what felt like a different chapter of his life, that the question wasn't whether to share it, but whether he shared it the way he wanted to, or let someone else tell a version that wasn't right. "I'll think about it," he said. "Give me 2 weeks." 2 weeks, she agreed. He hung up. He went to the kitchen. He made dinner. Not pasta. He'd bought groceries at the store on the way back from the airport, and he made a real meal, chicken and roasted sweet potatoes, and a salad that required more effort than it looked like. And he and Lily ate at the kitchen table with his sister, who was staying one more night before flying back to Portland. His sister ate everything on her plate and then looked across the table at him and said, "So, an independent research center. That's the plan. Funded by a billionaire." "A 30-year-old billionaire, yes." His sister looked at Lily. "What do you think?" "I think the governance structure needs careful review," Lily said. "And the IP licensing terms need to be explicit about the accessibility mandate, not just referenced." His sister looked back at Mason. "I like her," she said, as though she hadn't said this approximately 100 times before. "I really like this kid." "She's mine," he said. "Barely," his sister said. "She got most of her brain from Sarah." Nobody said anything for a moment. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that exists when something true has been said among people who are safe enough with each other to let it sit without immediately covering it. "Yeah," Mason said. "She did." The 4 to 6 weeks that Victoria's legal team needed stretched to 8, because the right structure for an independent entity with genuine governance autonomy and protected mandate turned out to be more complicated than the initial estimate, which Mason had privately predicted. He didn't push. He went back to the garage, picked up where he'd left with client work. Mrs. Delgado's Civic needed a follow-up. The Subaru Forester had a transmission issue he'd been working around, and continued developing the framework in the back room, which was what he would have been doing anyway. During those 8 weeks, 3 things happened that mattered. The first was the Auto Engineering International profile. He agreed to it, sat for 2 interviews with a journalist named Patricia Voss, who knew her subject well enough that he didn't have to explain context and could talk about the actual technical content. And the piece ran in February under the headline, "The Garage Architect," a title he hadn't chosen and wouldn't have chosen, but which was accurate enough to live with. The piece was thorough and well-written and treated the framework with the seriousness it deserved. It mentioned, in 2 paragraphs near the end, that Mason had personal reasons for focusing on integration failure and that he'd declined to detail them, and left it at that. He read those 2 paragraphs several times after the piece ran and decided they were right. The second thing was Dr. Clara Osei. She called him in January, not about the framework, but about Lily. "I said I wanted to talk to her," she said. "Does that still stand?" "If Lily wants to," he said, "it's her call." Lily wanted to. The video call lasted 45 minutes, and Mason was present for approximately the first 3 of them, before Lily turned to him and said, with the specific politeness of someone who wants a room to themselves, "Dad, you can go work." He went and worked, and through the thin wall between the kitchen and the back room, he could hear Lily's voice in the cadences of someone engaged in serious conversation, and once he heard her laugh, the real one, and he stood at the drafting table and felt something too large and too quiet to name. Afterward, Lily came to the back room and stood in the doorway. "She wants to do a summer research mentorship," she said, "at MIT, for exceptional secondary students with interest in engineering." He looked at her. "What did you say?" "I said I'd think about it." She looked at the wall of drawings. "It would mean going to Boston for 6 weeks." "I know." "Without you." "I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. Dr. Osei said the garage is where the best ideas come from sometimes. She said she did her most important thinking in a terrible shared office with no windows in her PhD program, and she keeps a photo of it on her wall to remember that good environments for thinking don't look like what you expect. "That sounds like her." She said you told her about the accessibility condition, the full category deployment requirement. "I mentioned it." Lily looked at him. She said that's the part that tells her who you are, not the framework itself. That detail. She paused. She said most engineers who build something this significant spend their energy protecting it. You spent your energy making sure it couldn't be kept away from people who needed it most. He didn't have an answer for that. He just looked at his daughter and thought about a mid-range sedan on Interstate 80 and the specific terrible democracy of a safety failure that doesn't check what car you can afford before it decides whether to save you. "Are you going to go?" he said. "MIT?" She thought about it honestly, the way she did things. "Yeah," she said. I think so. If the logistics work. The logistics will work, he said. The third thing that happened during those 8 weeks was harder to define. It happened gradually, in the accumulated small moments of day-to-day life. In phone calls with Victoria that grew incrementally less formal, in the way she started asking questions that weren't about the center or the framework, but about how things were going, which was a phrase that could carry a lot or a little, depending on who said it and how. She said it like she meant the full version. He didn't trust it immediately because trust isn't a switch, it's a process, and his had been switched off for a long time. But he noticed it. He noticed when she called on a Sunday evening for no stated reason and ended up talking for an hour about nothing in particular, the center's location search, which had landed on the East Bay, and a book she'd been reading about engineering failures, and the specific frustration of watching your board of directors misunderstand a decision you've made correctly. He noticed when she drove to Harlow one Saturday without any announced agenda and sat at the workbench while he finished work on a transmission and handed him tools when he asked without being told where they were, because she'd been here enough times now to know where things lived. He noticed when she looked at the photograph on the drafting table. She'd seen it before, but this time she looked at it longer and then looked at him and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. He noticed, and he filed it away with the careful honesty of a man who has been alone long enough to know what company feels like versus what it actually is, and who is determined not to confuse the two. The legal structure was finalized on a Tuesday in March, almost exactly 4 months after Chicago. Mason drove to San Francisco for the signing, which took 3 hours and involved a conference table and 2 lawyers, and a document that was, Lily had confirmed after reading it the previous week, correctly structured in all the ways that mattered. The accessibility mandate was explicit. The IP licensing terms protected the full category requirement. The governance board had genuine independence. Victoria's financial commitment was substantial and irrevocable within the defined parameters. Lily had read all 140 pages. She'd flagged 2 sections, both of which Mason had raised with the lawyers, both of which had been amended. He signed the documents. Victoria signed across the table from him. Her lawyer shook both their hands. His lawyer told him the entity would be formally registered within 5 business days. Outside the building, on a March afternoon with San Francisco doing what San Francisco does in March, cold sun and wind and the smell of the bay, Victoria stood on the sidewalk and looked at him with an expression he'd come to recognize as the one she wore when she was resisting the impulse to manage a moment. "So," she said. "So," he said, "the Cross-Sterling Independent Safety Research Center. We're still arguing about the name." "You've been arguing about the name for 6 weeks. It's the name." He looked at her. "It should be named for what it does, not for who started it. It should be named in a way people can find it and remember it and associate it with accountability." She held his gaze. "Cross-Sterling does that. I'll think about it." "You've been thinking about it for 6 weeks. Then I'll think about it for 1 more week." She almost smiled, and this time it got slightly further than usual, close enough to real that he registered the difference. They had lunch at a place near the waterfront, just the 2 of them, without lawyers or engineering teams or presentation logistics between them. He ordered fish, she ordered soup. She ate about half of it and then stopped and looked at the window and then back at him. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask?" "The photograph. On the drafting table." He looked at her. "Is that her?" she said. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "She has Lily's eyes." "Lily has her eyes," he said. The correction was automatic, gentle. "Of course." She looked at her hands briefly. "I'm sorry for what happened. I wanted to say that without it being attached to anything else, without it being part of a conversation about the work or the center." She looked at him directly. "Just that. I'm sorry it happened." He held her gaze. He thought about all the ways he could respond to this, all the distances he could keep between himself and the sincerity of what she'd just said, all the practiced deflections he'd gotten good at over 6 years. He let them all go. "Thank you," he said. They finished lunch. The afternoon moved on the way afternoons do. The center's first offices opened in the East Bay in April. a converted industrial space in Emeryville, close enough to Berkeley and Oakland to pull from the engineering talent in both, large enough to house the initial team of 12 without feeling cramped. Mason chose the space himself, walking through 6 properties with a real estate agent over 2 days before coming back to this one, which had north-facing skylights and a concrete floor and a loading dock that could handle equipment and a back room that he recognized, without sentimentality but not without feeling, as the shape of a room where work gets done. He kept the garage in Harlow. He drove back on weekends. He kept the regular clients, Mrs. Delgado, 2 others who'd been with him from the beginning, because there was something about the work that he didn't want to entirely give up, the specific satisfaction of a mechanical problem solved with hands and tools, the clean completeness of it. The Subaru Forester's transmission was finished in April. The owner picked it up and shook his hand and said she'd be back. He would be there when she came back. That mattered to him. The first hire at the center was a structural engineer from South Korea named Ji-won Park, who had a CV that should have landed her at a major automotive corporation and hadn't because the interview process had repeatedly evaluated her personality rather than her work, which was the industry's loss and Mason's gain. She was meticulous and blunt and had a habit of drawing problems on whatever surface was closest when she was thinking, which meant the whiteboards in the center covered ground fast. The second hire was a systems integration specialist from Brazil named Felipe Andrade, who had been doing precisely what Mason's framework addressed for a different company, and who, upon reading the framework documentation, sent Mason an email that said only, "How long have you known about this, and why did nobody publish it sooner?" Mason had written back, "Someone did, eventually." By the end of the first year, the center had 22 engineers from 11 countries. They were not the easiest 22 people he could have found. They had opinions, disagreed with each other in the specific productive way of people who care deeply about being right for the right reasons, and pushed back on Mason's decisions often enough that he was regularly reminded that creative authority in a collaborative environment means being wrong sometimes and saying so, which was harder than he'd expected and also necessary, and also, eventually, good. Tanaka Automotive's simulation facility in Palo Alto became a formal partner in June. Dr. Osei's research group at MIT signed a collaboration agreement in August. By the following spring, the first full-scale simulation of the unified framework had been run, and the results were what the mathematical modeling had predicted. The framework held. Not perfectly. There were 3 areas that required refinement, and Mason spent 6 weeks on each of them, and the refinements made the framework better than the original version in ways he hadn't anticipated, which was the thing about real testing that theoretical work can never fully replicate. Richard Holt's company, Arcadian Motors, announced a licensing agreement with the center in the fall of the second year. The press release used the word groundbreaking, which Mason had tried to edit out and which Victoria told him, firmly, was staying. Margaret Chen's office issued preliminary regulatory guidance recommending the Integration Architecture Framework as a reference standard for next-generation safety system certification. The guidance wasn't mandatory yet. It was the step before mandatory. Mason read the guidance document on a Tuesday morning in the center, Ji-won sitting across from him working on something else, Felipe on the phone in the corner, the skylights doing what north-facing skylights do, filling the room with the even, generous light that makes work possible. He read it twice, then he set it down on his desk. "Hey," Ji-won said without looking up from her work. "You're doing the thing where you're not doing anything." "I'm thinking." "You do that differently than people think." She glanced up. "What's the guidance say?" "That the framework is the reference standard." She put down her pen, looked at him. Then she picked the pen back up and went back to her work. But she was smiling, the small, genuine smile of someone who has been working hard on something for a long time and has just received a piece of information that tells them the work was real. He called Lily that evening. She was in her second year of high school, 15 now, which had happened with the specific stealth of time passing around a person you love. He'd looked up one day and she was a different version of herself, taller, more certain, carrying the seriousness she'd always had, but wearing it differently, more comfortably, like she'd finally grown into it. She was still in Harlow at the house. He was in Oakland during the week, back on weekends. The arrangement worked because they'd built it carefully, and because Lily was Lily, which was its own category of reliability. "The guidance is out," he said when she answered. A pause, and he could hear her setting something down. "Reference standard?" "Reference standard." She was quiet for a moment. He knew what she was doing with the silence. She was feeling the weight of it without performing a reaction, which was something he recognized because he'd just done the same thing. "That's it," she said finally. Not a question, just placing the fact. "That's the step before mandatory," he said. "Mandatory is the next one. That'll take another 2 or 3 years through the regulatory process." "But it's moving." "It's moving." Another silence. Then, "Dad, you know what this means, right? When it's mandatory, when it's in every car." "I know what it means." "The thing that happened to Mom," she said, carefully, in the quiet way she talked about it when she talked about it. Not often, but when she did, directly, without softening it into abstraction. That specific category of failure. It won't be able to happen the same way. "No," he said, "it won't." She didn't say anything after that for a moment. He didn't either. They were just two people on a phone in different cities feeling the weight of something that had taken 6 years to build and longer than that to understand was worth building. "I'm going to go," Lily said. "I have homework." "Okay? Dad?" "Yeah." "I'm proud of you," she said, simple and direct, the way she said everything that mattered. He sat in his office in the East Bay, in the building with the north-facing skylights, and he held the phone for a moment after she hung up. And he thought about a girl who had photographed her father's drawings in the middle of the night and posted them to engineering forums because she believed in something enough to act without permission, and about how the particular courage of that act had set everything else in motion, and about how he hadn't thanked her properly for it, not in the way it deserved. He called back. She answered on the first ring. "Did you forget something?" "I wanted to say something," he said. "I should have said it earlier. I've been meaning to say it for a while." A pause. "Okay." "What you did," he said, "the night you posted the drawings. I know you apologized. I know we talked about it. But I never told you. Outside of all the conversations about whether it was okay and why you did it and what happened because of it, I never just said, thank you." The phone was quiet. "You saw something I was protecting past the point where it needed protecting," he said, "and you did something about it. At 12. By yourself. In the middle of the night." He paused. That took more courage than most adults manage, and it changed everything. Lily was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had the slight roughness of someone who is managing something. "I knew it was right," she said. "That's all. That's not a small thing. Knowing it's right and doing it anyway when you're not sure what happens next. You do that," she said. "You did it in Chicago. I had 8 weeks to prepare for Chicago. You had a laptop in one night." She made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "Go to sleep, Dad." "Okay." "And eat something that isn't just coffee." "I had lunch." "What was it?" A pause. "Coffee and a granola bar." "Dad." "I'll get dinner." "Promise." "Yeah," he said. "I promise." He got dinner. A real one, from the place 3 blocks from the office that had good food and didn't require a reservation, and where the guy behind the counter had started recognizing him and asking about the work, in the general interested way of someone who doesn't need the technical details, but likes knowing that something is happening nearby that matters. He sat at a table by the window. He ate. He watched the street outside. The ordinary Tuesday evening traffic of a city doing what cities do, moving, generating noise and light, and the continuous, improbable fact of a lot of human lives happening simultaneously in a small space. He thought about an ordinary Thursday afternoon 3 years earlier, when an expensive car had pulled into a gravel lot in Harlow, and a woman in a charcoal blazer had looked at 6 years of his life and called it a promising sketch. He thought about how a story can start in the worst possible place and still end up somewhere worth being. Not because the worst place gets erased. It doesn't. The loss is still the loss and the grief is still real, and some nights he still lies awake with the weight of a November highway in the rain pressing down on his chest. And there's nothing to do with that except carry it, which he does. That's the part people who haven't lost something significant don't always understand. The resolution doesn't mean the wound heals clean. It means you find a way to build something real alongside the wound, not instead of it. The framework exists because Sarah is gone. Those two things are permanently linked, and the framework will be in millions of cars eventually, and it will catch failures that would have been catastrophic. And somewhere out there, a person in a mid-range sedan on a rain-slicked highway will go home to their family because the systems in their car communicated with each other in the fraction of a second that mattered, and they will not know why, and Mason will know why, and that's enough. That's more than enough. Victoria came to the center in November, a few days before the second anniversary of Chicago. She came by herself, no assistant, no agenda, the way she'd been coming since the early days when they were still working out how to occupy the same space without defaulting to the professional structure that was easier but less true. She walked through the main floor, talked to Jiwon and Felipe, looked at the simulation results from the current testing phase with genuine engagement rather than managerial interest, and then sat across from Mason in his office with 2 coffees from the place down the street and said, "How are you doing, actually?" He thought about it. He did that now. Actually thought about it rather than defaulting to fine. "Good," he said. "Actually?" She looked at him, deciding if that was the real answer. "The guidance document." "Yeah. That's what it feels like." "Part of it." He looked at his coffee. "There's the work part and then there's the other part. They're not the same thing." She nodded. She understood the distinction. He didn't have to explain it to her anymore, which itself was something that had changed. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want to be clear that I'm not saying it because it connects to anything else. Not the center, not the work." He looked at her. "You're a good person to know," she said. "I wasn't when I came to your garage. I was a person who moved through the world at a pace that didn't leave room for anything I couldn't immediately evaluate. And knowing you—" She stopped, started again. "I'm slower now, in ways that matter." He looked at her for a moment. "You called the wrong thing a sketch," he said. "And then you drove to a diner in Harlow on a foggy morning and you meant it when you said you were wrong. That's not nothing." "It's the minimum," she said. "It's more than the minimum. You'd be surprised how rarely people manage the minimum." She looked at him steadily. There was something in her expression that had been arriving gradually over months, and that he recognized now clearly for what it was, and that he felt something specific about, not simple, not uncomplicated, but real. "I know this is slow," she said. I'm not trying to rush anything. I just want you to know that I notice, that I'm here, and I notice." He held her gaze. "I know," he said. "I notice too." They sat for a moment in the office with the skylights above them and the sound of the center working on the other side of the wall. People doing serious things because the work mattered, because they'd chosen to be here for the right reasons, because Mason had built the conditions where that was possible. It wasn't what he'd had. It wasn't Sarah. And it wasn't the life that had existed before the rain and the highway and the fraction of a second that changed everything. He was not naive enough to think it could be that, or that he was the same person who had gone to Detroit full of the certainty that the future was a straight line pointing up. He was 35 years old, and he had a daughter who was going to MIT in the summer to work with one of the best engineering minds in the country, and a garage in Harlow that still smelled of motor oil and still had a corkboard full of drawings on the wall, and a center full of people working on a problem that mattered because he had once been unable to do anything but work on it alone, and a photograph on a drafting table, and a life that was not what he'd planned and not what he'd wanted when he was 26, but which was, if he was honest, which he tried always to be. Genuinely, imperfectly, stubbornly worth living. That winter, Lily got her acceptance letter from MIT's summer research program. She showed it to him on a Saturday morning in the kitchen in Harlow, sliding it across the table with the careful casualness of someone who has been waiting to do this for weeks and doesn't want to make a big deal of it, but cannot entirely prevent a big deal from being made. He read it. He put it down. He looked at his daughter. She was 15 and she had her mother's eyes and her mother's brain and her own stubbornness and her own precision and her own version of the quiet certainty that had walked into his garage at 12 years old and photographed 6 years of his life and sent it into the world because she believed it deserved to be there. "Well," he said. "Well," she said back, "you know what this means?" "That I have to go to Boston in June." "That you're going to Boston in June." She looked at the letter, then at him. "Are you okay with that?" He thought about the honest answer, which was, "I will miss you in ways I don't know how to account for, and I am prouder of you than I know how to say, and both of those things are completely true at the same time." "Yeah," he said. "I'm more than okay with it." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, briefly, in the direct physical way she sometimes expressed things when words weren't exactly right. Then she pulled her hand back and picked up the letter and said, "I should reply today," and went to her room. He sat at the kitchen table for a while. Outside the window, the valley was still and gray and winter bare, the oaks stripped down to their architecture, the fields flat and quiet under a low sky. The smell of coffee was in the kitchen, and somewhere down the street a neighbor's dog was doing its weekend thing, and the garage sat attached to the house the way it always had, small and ordinary and full of the specific history of a person who had been broken and had not stopped working. He thought about what it means to build something with grief rather than despite it. The difference matters. Building despite grief is survivorship. You get through it, you come out the other side, the wound closes. Building with grief is something else. It means the wound stays open in a productive way, stays informing the work, stays insisting that what you build has to be worth what it cost. It's harder. It doesn't close as neatly, but what it produces tends to be truer. He'd made his peace with that. Not all at once, and not completely, and not in any moment that could be called a resolution. More like the accumulating evidence of days on which the work was real, and the people around him were real, and his daughter was extraordinary, and the framework was in the regulatory guidance, and the garage still smelled like motor oil, and he was, on balance, still here. That was enough. That had always been the actual standard, even when he'd lost track of it in the long, quiet years. Still here, still working, still building something that mattered toward something worth mattering toward. He got up. He washed the coffee cups. He went to the garage. The back room was the same as it had always been. The original drawings on the corkboard, the drafting table, the 2 task lights, the bookshelf of references that he hadn't needed in months, but hadn't moved because they were part of what the room was. The photograph on the table, the chip in the coffee mug rim. He stood at the table for a moment. Then he sat down, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, and started working on something he'd been thinking about for 2 weeks. Not a refinement of the existing framework, but a next problem. A related class of failure that the framework's success had made newly visible. The way solving one thing always illuminates the shape of the thing behind it. He'd told Jiwan about it yesterday, and she'd said, "Yes, that's the next one. I've been thinking about it too." And he'd said, "Good, let's start thinking out loud about it." And she'd said, "I already am." He drew. He made notes. He crossed things out and drew again. The morning light came through the 2 small west-facing windows and fell across the table in the particular way it fell in winter, flat and honest. Not warm, but present. Outside in the valley, the day was beginning. The garage held its smell, its quiet, its accumulated history of work done in the only way that work worth doing can be done. Slowly, honestly, by a person who knew what it was for. Mason cross-worked. The page filled.